Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ashley Bess. I am part of the Department of State Hospitals team helping manage the DSH Diversion program. Just want to say welcome to day 5 of our DSH Diversion Academy, and thank you so much for taking this journey with us through this training series to help prepare you to think through your potential local diversion programs and assist with your development of your program plan documentation to submit to us at DSH. Just a couple quick housekeeping reminders. If you can please make sure if you are not speaking that you're muted, whether you are a panelist or a participant. That way we can limit any background noise, and I will be going through just when I do hear anything and trying to mute folks if I see that anybody is unmuted who is not speaking or presenting. If you have any questions or need anything technical assistance-wise from me, you can go ahead and send some messages in the chat. We will be, of course, pausing for questions and have time for questions throughout our day today, but you can always send questions in as you think of them to the chat box, and we'll be monitoring that. And we will also open up the lines and unmute folks to ask questions out loud at certain points of the day as well. Sean, do you want to go ahead just to the agenda slide? So, just to give you a quick overview of what we will be focusing on today. So really in our first 4 sessions, we focused on a lot of what you need to think about and take into consideration before you have folks out in the community in your program, the types of services you need to set up, how you can find housing, how you can determine eligibility, what your referral process will be, what your stakeholder communication will be like throughout. And today we wanted to kind of pivot and talk a little bit about some issues you may come across once you do have people out in the community receiving services in your program. And so today's focus, the first part of today's focus, the first half of today will focus on really how you can manage risk on kind of an ongoing, continual basis out in the community, what that looks like in a program like this. We will also have a presentation from Katie Herman, who has been helping us with this entire training session. She's been our lead partner over at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. She will be doing a presentation for you all on just how to be prepared in case there are bad outcomes in a program. And then we'll do another breakout like we normally do to discuss and work through some of the corresponding questions and prompts in the program plan template that tie into this day. Take a quick break, and then we are going to have a panel discussion in the second half of the day with some representatives from a few of our other county programs who have been able to join us today. So we will be featuring, again, Dr. Sarah Demray will be joining us again for our first presentation alongside our own, DSH's own Dr. Sean Evans, to talk to you about community risk management. We will be joined again by Dr. Deb Peinel to also discuss what treatment providers can do to manage risk of violence in the community. As I mentioned before, Katie Herman will be doing a presentation, and then our panelists who are joining us today are coming from our programs in San Luis Obispo County, Ventura County, and Del Norte County. So we're really looking forward to that, and we are going to be leaving a lot of time for you all to ask questions of our panelists once we go through the panel's questions that we have ready to go. So start thinking about some questions you might want to ask our current counties about how, what it was like planning, what it was like implementing their programs, how their programs are going. And then, of course, if you have other questions as well at the end of the day for any of our presenters, we can also take those questions as well. So I think with that, we will go ahead and transition into our first presentation of the day with Dr. Demeray and Dr. Evans.
Great, thank you so much, Ashley, appreciate that. Welcome everyone to day 5 of our Diversion Academy. Dr. Demeray and I will be talking about managing risk and promoting success in the community. And so it's really exciting to be able to talk to you all about this topic, and you know, I really look forward to any questions afterwards. One of the things I think you'll see that's sort of a thread that weaves through our presentation today is, you know, although we're really talking about managing risk, we really want to emphasize this idea of promoting success and improvement in our, you know, the individuals we work with. Oops. Just kind of a quick overview of what we'll be talking about in this presentation. First, we'll provide a brief introduction. Then we'll go through strategies informed by the R&R model and framework. And Dr. Demeray will go through each one of those principles, the risk and need and responsivity principles. Then I'll come back to talk about scenario planning, and then we'll have some time for questions. So just a quick introduction. One of the things that, you know, I think is really important just to think about, and that is, you know, the work that we do is incredibly complicated. It can be really uncertain. And so, you know, we work with individuals who have very complicated diagnoses, you know, which include serious mental illness, potentially substance use, potentially trauma, potentially, you know, traumatic brain injury, as well as some sort of involvement in the criminal justice system. So these are really complex issues, and we need a frame. We really need a framework to help guide our decisions through this process. And so one of the things that we've been talking a lot about, and that like different presenters have presented, is helping us sort of to create a frame or a framework to help guide us through that process. So what I'd like to propose, and what we'd like to propose, is the idea that the frame, if you think of the sort of the 4 sides of the frame that I just showed, that the frame that we've really been talking about is informed by different empirically supported models and approaches and strategies. You've heard a lot throughout these Diversion Academy presentations about the R&R model. The reason we keep coming back to this is because it's an empirically supported, robust model that can help guide this process. We've also talked about assessment, and specifically the essential need for empirically supported risk assessment approaches. The structured professional judgment, or SPJ approach, is one of those. We also need to really think about like implementing management strategies that also have empirical or sort of data evidence support behind them. One of those that Dr. Demeray is going to talk today about is the service referral matrix, which again just provides a nice sort of structure, you know, help guide your decisions. Also, and that kind of another principle is this idea that, you know, risk assessment is a process, and you probably recall that flow diagram that Dr. Demeray has talked about, you know, that includes all the different elements of that process of risk assessment. We really need to move away from this idea that risk assessment is some sort of event that happens, you know, that we do the assessment and then we're done. Risk assessment is a process that continues to inform the other side of the coin, which is risk management. And so this is just an ongoing process that we need to always sort of be going through. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn the time over to Dr. Demeray.
Thanks, everyone. And I'm going to revisit and hopefully try to make a bit more concrete what we've been talking about in terms of what do we actually do to implement these different principles. So I'm going to start with the risk principle and try and get to the next slide. So you've seen this already. This is the idea that we need to match the level of intensity and frequency of supervision and services to the level of risk. When we have somebody who is higher risk, we need to do more resources, more services, more intervention. Somebody who's lower risk, fewer resources, fewer services, less intervention. None of this should be new, but I just want to emphasize here that risk assessment results should really be used to inform and support a minimum level of care. So in other words, to be just more kind of clear about that is, how do we get people into the community and what level of services do we need to have to ensure their safety and the safety of others? So what does that look like? What does that mean in the context of diversion? Next slide, please, Sean. Yes, if you can go one back. Thanks. And I think maybe Deb, I'm getting some feedback from you, so if you're able to mute if you haven't already, thanks. So I wanted to just share here some very broad guidelines of, not specific to any one instrument, but what does it mean when we say low, moderate, and high? When I talk about this, I like to think about it as it relates to intervention as opposed to a probability of a future behavior. So instead of really talking about somebody who's low risk is at this level or has this probability of violence or recidivism, instead what I want to say is if somebody's at low risk, it means that we don't need to do much with this individual. It means that this individual can usually do very well and be very successful with routine monitoring and reassessment. So basically this is something that does not indicate the need for additional supervision or additional intervention and services. And as I've alluded to or said earlier in previous sessions for the Academy, this would not be really, in my view, the kind of person that is appropriate for the level of care and the level of resources that's going to come along with this specific diversion program. So when we're moving into the next sort of level or category, when we're talking about moderate risk for, in this case, let's think about it in terms of future risk to public safety, so violent behavior in the community, here what we want to talk about is that it means that there must be some level of focus, risk management, and intervention. It needs to be well planned and needs to be targeted, but it doesn't mean that this person is inappropriate for diversion to the community. What it means is that we need to provide services to risk manage and promote safety. And then finally, when we have high risk in this kind of model, for me, again, thinking more about what do we do as opposed to is there some concrete likelihood of future behavior. Here, it means that we need to have more intense and specialized supervision and services. So here we would want to have intervention strategies that are specialized, that are targeted, and that we really are going to be talking about more frequent contact and sessions. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a minute. But essentially, for me, what this is all about is saying how much are we supposed to be doing in terms of level of intervention, not is there an appropriate person who should or could be diverted to the community based on risk alone. So again, just to reiterate, it's about thinking through the level of supervision and services. Okay, Sean, next slide. So here I wanted to give you some examples of what does that mean when we're talking about more moderate or high risk and kind of what would the appropriate levels of intervention be. So there's various different models that we can use. I really like the levels of care that the American Society of Addiction Medicine have put together. And I don't think that these need to be specific to addiction or substance use, because I think what they do is really outline and provide very specific definitions of what would it look like to have somebody who needs outpatient services. What level of intervention is that? How frequent? What kind of intervention? What does it look like when we have somebody who would require or benefit from intensive outpatient or partial hospitalization, residential and inpatient services, and then finally at the most kind of intense or highest level of care, we'd be talking about medically monitored inpatient services. So what I want to sort of just share from the get-go is that when we're thinking about the kind of level of resourcing and intervention that would be commensurate with this diversion program that we're talking about, we're really covering here somewhere around like a level 2 or 3. So we're intensive outpatient, or even moving into some partial hospitalization residential. I want to just be clear that I don't think that what we're talking about when we're talking about diversion, or IST felony diversion in particular, is not early intervention or outpatient services. So Sean, can you go to the next slide? So this is a picture available, just a diagram that shows sort of a visual of how these things would lay out on a continuum of care. So here you can see that there really is, you know, very much less intense services if you're on the left-hand side of the form, and then as you're moving up that scale or moving up those levels of care, you're starting to see sort of more intense or clustering around the amount of services that are being given. And I encourage you all to go ahead. This is available free for download on the ASAM website. But this is just one way that I like to think about, well, what does this mean when we say somebody who's in diversion should be getting intensive outpatient services? Sean, next slide, please. And so for each of these levels, the ASAM has really kind of broken down what they describe or require for each of the levels. So outpatient here would be just 1 hour of therapy or 1 session per week, could include medication management. We're assuming the client is capable of getting themselves to the office and to manage their own care across providers, and it's not really appropriate for unstable or complex needs clients. Where I'm seeing more of a fit in this particular model with diversion would be with intensive outpatient treatment. So here we're talking typically 9 or more hours of services per week, but less than 20, so giving some kind of guidelines around how much time we should be spending with somebody, or how much time different service providers should be spending with the person altogether. We're looking at having some kinds of services or interventions several or most days of the week. Many of the hours that were just described from that kind of 9 to 20 would involve some level of therapeutic intervention. So in other words, it's not just a check-in, it's not just a phone call, it would actually have some kind of therapeutic focus. And there is a need to organize care across providers. So again, it's not going to be left to the individual, the person that's being diverted to manage and organize their care. It's recognized here that it can be appropriate for people who are not quite stable at this point, who have complex needs, and that they're going to need help to kind of manage and organize and coordinate across these different services that they might be receiving for 9 to 20 hours per week. So that's one model that I think can be useful to just look generally at thinking through kind of how much, not necessarily what, but how much and how many services and hours should somebody be having during a week. So I'm going to show another example. Sean, next slide. And this is the 5-level risk and needs system that was developed by CSG, and that I was fortunate to be a member of the advisory board. And this is very small, so I'm going to break it down in a minute. But essentially what they're looking at here is more focused specifically on recidivism and risk for reoffending, and they've been kind of put together through consensus and various work with different stakeholders. What would each one of these levels look like? So Sean, next slide, please. And again, I encourage you to download this, and this is available, and I'm sure Katie and Hallie and others can share the link. But where I view diversion programs sitting very nicely is somewhere in level 3 and 4, leaning more towards level 4, honestly. So level 3 is like the middle of a risk distribution. So if you think, you know, we have 100 or 1,000 people, level 3 would be in the middle of that. And this is going to be somebody who has multiple risks and some needs, and a couple of primary drivers of involvement in the system. The idea here is that they're going to have some level of, or, you know, benefit from some level of community supervision, and that there's going to be some secondary attention to non-criminogenic needs. So what does that mean? So as we talked about in previous session, criminogenic needs are those needs that are specifically related to offending behavior, while non-criminogenic could be things that would exacerbate or potentially make things worse. So often we think about behavioral health needs or housing or other issues that don't necessarily directly affect or lead to crime for this person, but that also there are some benefits indirectly. here, you know, based on one study, they suggested that we might be looking at somewhere between 100 to 200 hours of intervention across program duration. Where I see a better fit for the IST felony diversion program is really around level 4. So now we're saying that people who are going to be here are above average in terms of their risk of reoffending. We're going to look at having individuals in this group who have multiple risks and needs, and they likely have a history of incarceration or of kind of more considerable system, justice system involvement. And this is, again, coming back to and very kind of similar to what I was suggesting in the ASAM model, is that now we're going to be talking about more intensive community supervision and more comprehensive services across a variety of providers. So again, really looking to more complex risks and needs and a combination of criminogenic and behavioral health needs that are likely interplaying and contributing together to justice system involvement and involvement in the state hospital system. Here now, the suggestion, again, based on one study, was that there would be somewhere around 200 to 300 hours of services and intervention as a function of this risk level. Now, these are just very broad, general kind of guidelines in terms of thinking through what this looks like, but what I really wanted to drive home here is that there are different models and resources that each of you can look at in terms of figuring out what does intensive community supervision look like for people in the IST felony diversion program in your community, and then what resources, what programs need to, or services need to be put into place to ensure that you're achieving this kind of level of frequency and contact with individuals. Next slide, please, Sean. So, of course, the caveat here is that these are very general guidelines, and what you really want to do is ensure that you're doing a very well thought out and planned, thorough assessment of an individual's risks and needs, and that then you're tailoring the level of intervention to that person and their circumstance. Next slide, please. So that's just a little bit to think about how do you operationalize the idea of implementing the risk principle. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the needs principle in the same way. So next slide, please. So here we went through this already. We talked about how the needs principle is really about knowing and targeting in treatment and intervention what factors are causing that particular person to get involved in the criminal justice system. It's not what factors cause people in general to be involved, but rather what is it that's driving it for this person. And when we have a better match between what their drivers are and what we're doing with them and what we're targeting an intervention, we're going to have improved outcomes, both in terms of risk mitigation, but also their trajectories and system involvement and health and well-being. Next slide, please. So one of the things that Sean mentioned is an approach that we and others have used to really provide more clear guidance in a given agency or community around how do you connect risk levels, risk management, and treatment plans. And essentially what this is about a community or an agency coming up with what are the list of services that we have available in our community. So what places and can we refer somebody to, and what needs and risk factors do those services target? So for example, do we have substance use services and specific kinds of substances that are being addressed by given agencies? Do we have different kinds of interventions that might be adapted for people with serious mental illnesses, but that are targeting criminogenic factors? And so it's really about creating almost a menu or a list of services and then organizing them to think about information on that'll also map onto the risk principle. So thinking about, this program, how frequent does it meet, what's its schedule, how many hours is it, and really start to integrate the risk and the need principle. So I wanted to show you just an example of what this would look like at a very high level, but this is the kind of thing that, myself or others can work with each of you in each of your communities to develop a service matrix for your community. Next slide, please. So here's one example that I drew from a community-based mental health organization I was working with in North Carolina. And these are just two little pieces of the broader service matrix. So here they were using a risk assessment tool that had 3 levels. So it has low, moderate, and high, and we provided some operational definitions of what the level of service might be indicated there. And then here I'm showing you what we had for mental health and substance use, but then we had a bunch of other needs and risk factors that, filled out this table. So under the column for mental health, so if we had somebody who was low, what we said there is that they are just going to continue on in their usual care and likely have some level of antipsychotic medication targeting their serious mental illness. Once we had somebody who is at moderate risk, and this was in relation to violence towards others, then we were going to be looking at having somebody who has more intensive case management, illness management, recovery, or some other really targeted program that has a more frequent number of meetings per week, and also that's going to be really much more targeted. And then if we had somebody in this particular program who was at high risk for violence towards others, they wanted to do an evaluation for referral. It doesn't mean that they are referring and requiring admission to an acute care unit, but rather they wanted to ensure that a step was taken to continue to provide that moderate level of service while also making sure there was not a need for hospitalization. So this way, this is how they could really take the information from the risk assessment and move into risk management. And then similarly, you can see there for the example, if you had, if they had a person who was presenting with substance use problems, they could move through this referral matrix to help them make recommendations and really almost like a shortcut in their decision-making process to say, okay, we've got somebody who has substance use problems, they're at a moderate risk, what kinds of options or services or programs do we have in our community that could be appropriate? All right, so next slide, please. So lastly, we have to also really be more concrete about what does it mean to be responsive and to enact the responsivity principle of the model. Next slide. You've seen this slide already, so I showed it before, and really responsivity is thinking about how do we tailor what we're doing to promote the best response possible for this person, both, again, in terms of risk mitigation, but also their trajectories and their health and well-being. So I'm going to give some examples of what we would anticipate or what could be considered for general responsivity and specific responsivity, which are 2 different aspects of this overall approach. Next slide, please. So here, when we're talking about general responsivity, in short, we're saying use the kinds of strategies with demonstrated effectiveness in changing behavior. So in other words, use interventions and services that are evidence-based, that we know to work, avoid ones that don't. That's a very kind of common sense recommendation, but sometimes we find that that common sense recommendation isn't followed in practice, so I think it bears repeating. The other thing that I wanted to emphasize here is that within this kind of general responsivity, meaning for everyone that we work with, we should emphasize the importance of the working alliance. So in other words, how valuable it is to establish a warm, respectful, and trusting collaborative working alliance or therapeutic alliance. So really focusing on developing trust and having empathy and understanding when you're working with somebody. The other thing that we should do as providers or people interacting with clients is to use the structuring principle. So really for us to be role models in prosocial behavioral modeling, providing structures to support prosocial behavior. And here, the one that I think is really important that we can do a better job of, particularly in community-based settings, is creating opportunities for reinforcement. So if you're expecting and looking for behavior change, if you have a client who's engaging in skill building and taking part in other different kinds of programs, and we're looking for them to be engaging in positive behavior, well, we have to come up with strategies for acknowledging when they're engaging in positive behavior. And unfortunately, what we see a lot of particularly in diversion programs, is rather than we see reinforcement of positive behavior, we instead see punishment of negative behavior. And this goes into a little bit about how we need to focus on a harm reduction model, which we'll get to in another minute. But again, just creating strategies to, first of all, know if the client is doing well, and to be able to also acknowledge in kind of real time or as close to real time as possible when they are doing the things that we're hoping that they'll do, instead of just pointing out when they're doing things that we don't want them to do. Next slide, please. So the next thing with responsivity is to think about the person and their environment and things about that we might need or want to change. And I gave a lot of examples here, but just thinking about the individual's personality, their literacy, their cognitive functioning, their gender, other aspects of their identity, whether they have a trauma history, cultural issues worth consideration, how motivated they are. These are all things that we will want to essentially meet the person where they are and make adaptations or changes to how we're interacting with them and what services we're offering and expecting them to use. External responsivity then looks at us as the providers, the care environment, the community, and things kind of bigger picture. What are things about those external environments that we would really want to change to promote a positive outcome? And so it's not just about considering the characteristics of the individual, but also where they are and how that might be impacting their risk to others and to themselves. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give some examples of what these kinds of adaptations might be. So we'll talk again, next slide, we'll do a little bit more on harm reduction, and it's already been talked about in one of the previous presentations from Dr. Peinels earlier in the Academy. But other things that we might consider is motivational interviewing principles. One of my favorites there is rolling with resistance. So instead of kind of pushing and arguing against somebody who wants to or doesn't want to do something, actually asking them about why they don't want to do those things or they do want to do those things. Using trauma-informed practices, being focused on growth mindsets and growth mindset language. And so I think this is something really powerful, again, that we can just change in our language. So rather than talking about a person as being a certain way, instead talking about how people can change. There could be needs for gender-specific services. Really liked the conversation a couple sessions ago and the third day around cultural humility and using multicultural approaches. Other kinds of accommodations that might be necessary, adaptations to existing curricula, or even translations into different languages or other ways. So just some examples of how we can take a fairly set program and still make things more responsive and thus promote positive change for the individual. Next slide, please. So just a couple more things. Jeff Peinels talked about harm reduction more as it related to treatment, and I just wanted to kind of also say that this is equally as important when we're thinking about risk assessment and public safety. We have to expect that mental health diversion program clients will fail. These are very complex, high-need individuals by definition. According to the legislation, that's who we're looking at coming into these programs. And it's not realistic that we're going to see full mental health recovery, no more substance use relapse, and no more new criminal activity. So I really just think we need to abandon that frame that these are actually things that we don't expect, but rather that these are things we will expect. The goals of diversion are not to eliminate these things, but rather to promote treatment access and service utilization, to promote stability and functioning to the extent possible, and to really, I view it as increasing time or tenure in the community. Again, I'm going to expect, especially with something like an IST felony diversion program, that these individuals will return at some point to the system, whether that be the legal system or the hospital system. So what our kind of strategy needs to be is to be about how do we prolong the amount of time that they're living in the community successfully. this is not just sort of Pollyanna or, you know, a really optimistic outlook or overly kind of sugar-coated way of thinking about it. What we know from the research in terms of both behavioral health outcomes and also criminal justice outcomes is that harm reduction approaches are much more effective in the long term and also save money in the long term compared to zero tolerance or abstinence-only programs. So I just wanted to really emphasize that it's not just that we feel like this is a good idea or that this is the nice thing, but rather this is also how we see greater effectiveness in promoting long-term behavior change. All right, next slide, please. Thanks, Sean. With that, I'll hand it over to you for some scenario planning.
Great, thank you so much. So I want to just spend a few minutes talking about scenario planning. And before I talk about it, I just want to mention that scenario planning is a strategy that's been used in the business world and military and by other organizations and in other organizational settings to help prepare and organize resources in order to manage risk. It's also been implemented and adopted in violence risk assessment as well. And when we talk about scenario planning, what we're really talking about is when we consider plausible scenarios or trajectories that might happen during an identified time frame. So just to put this succinctly, we're really talking about short narratives that are designed to simplify complex issues in a way that facilitates communication and planning. So scenario planning is really a management strategy. This has more to do with planning and prevention as opposed to prediction. And so management strategies are just a great, scenario planning is just a great way to bridge the information that we've gotten from our assessments into our management strategies. So what we want to do with scenario planning is we want to identify different scenarios involving the most likely outcomes of concern. So again, we're talking about plausible scenarios, things that are realistic or plausible for the individual that we're evaluating and thinking of creating management strategies, not necessarily our sort of worst, you know, a projection of our worst nightmares. That's not what we're looking for here. So what this does, though, is it really helps inform our timing, frequency, intensity, and type of risk management strategy. So when we're talking about scenario planning, I just want to differentiate scenarios of concern, which I'll talk about here, with scenarios of improvement. So first, talking about, you know, sort of focusing on scenarios of concern, you know, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it does occasionally rhyme from time to time. And so one of the things that we want to do is we want to sort of learn from and sort of take into consideration a person's past, but, you know, as we sort of conceptualize sort of future risk and manage that, but we also want to realize that experience and patterns can change over time. So when we think of scenarios in scenario planning and scenarios of concern, this can include a couple of different types, and these are just different kinds of scenarios that you may want to sort of plan for. Sort of the most common is what we sometimes refer to a repeat scenario or a flat trajectory scenario. And this is essentially when a person engages in, you know, some sort of adverse outcome or engages in some sort of violent behavior in a way that's similar to their past. You know, in this case, we want to consider all sort of past violence, not just necessarily the most recent. Our twist scenario, on the other hand, or sometimes what we refer to as our sideways trajectory, this is where the violence changes or evolves in some way. This could be a change in sort of the motivation, the victim, or the sort of behavioral topology. So this is some sort of twist or change that's, again, kind of not sort of what we have seen historically. And then finally, we have what's known as the escalating scenario. And this is, again, kind of, you know, also sometimes referred to as the worst case scenario. So I just want to say here, worst case scenario, again, we want to combine sort of plausible scenarios, not, again, sort of our projected kind of worst nightmares. And Katie's going to spend some time later in today's academy talking about ways to kind of think about these and manage these. So we want to come up with scenarios of concern, but in addition to that, we also want to think about scenarios of improvement. And these are scenarios in which individuals that we're working with get better. And so, again, we want to try to identify at least one type of scenario of improvement in our overall scenario planning sort of strategy. This is where we're looking at, increased stability, improved functioning, and overall recovery. And kind of similar to the same sort of frame as scenarios of concern, the scenarios of improvement may include a repeat scenario. So this is really thinking about in the past when the individuals that we're working with have had periods of time where they've been doing well. Maybe this is where they're getting, IM medications and they have supportive housing and they're having sort of relatively, sort of extended periods of stability and so forth. A twist scenario is sort of thinking about situations in which a person gets better sort of unexpectedly. So a new pro-social healthy relationship, a new job employment opportunity and so forth. So these are, again, scenarios of improvement that sort of go in ways that we don't expect. And finally, the accelerated improvement or best case scenario. And this is what is best and likely for the individual we're working for. And again, I just want to kind of anchor this, I think, in Sarah's last slide about, coming up with sort of plausible, realistic sort of expectations and so forth. So that best case scenario is really within that frame. So, all right. Final thoughts. Sarah, did you want to start us off with this one?
Sure. So next slide, Sean, thanks.
Yep.
So I wanted to just sort of come back to the idea that I've touched on a few times, that Sean brought up at the beginning of this as well, that we're viewing risk assessment as a process and it's not like an event or a product. So my hope in working with people, and I hope yours as well, is that as we have them in the community and we're doing all this great intervention and have this wonderful risk management and treatment plan, that things change, that things get better. So one of the things that I would really encourage you all to think about as you're planning your program is what are the strategies for us to notice when there is change? How do we know if there are changes? And to have sort of realistic expectations of what that would look like, to implement and have a strategy for coming back to review the assessment and to modify it as necessary. I always like to say, if we're doing our jobs and things are going well, we have to have strategies to be able to provide that change and that kind of reassessment of their risk to self and others. And, ideally over the course in diversion in the community, we will see that for a lot of people. I will just emphasize that people get scared when I say risk assessments have a shelf life and you need to do it again. I don't believe this needs to be something where you don't look back at what the previous assessment was. This is not some kind of, test, retest, reliability kind of situation, or where you can't look at your previous assessment. I really approach it like, okay, well, what has changed for the individual, for better or for worse? What's the same? What strategies need to change and what strategies need to continue? So it just provides, a few short questions, honestly, that you can probably do a reassessment, I think, in 5 or 10 minutes, just to make sure that we're still providing the appropriate services and that we're considering those scenarios and, the likelihood that they might play out in the future. Sean, anything else you want to add on that?
No, I mean, I think that really captures it. And again, I think it's important to just sort of reemphasize that, I think, reevaluating and reassessing individuals doesn't have to be this huge ordeal. And there's no need to really start from scratch, that this is something that, again, previous assessment and documentation can help inform sort of future assessment and reassessment and so forth. So, I think incorporating these principles, these frames, if you will, I think really allows us to improve, again, the structured, decision-making and allows us to utilize more structured strategies to help, mitigate risk and really promote success among the individuals we work with. All right, So I think that's it in terms of our presentation. Were there any questions?
Hi, everybody. As a reminder, you can send questions in through the chat box, and I don't believe I see any that have come in quite yet. You can also use the raise hand icon to raise your hand, and we can call on you as well if you think of something in the moment. So why don't we give it a moment here, Sean, and see if anybody gets something in the chat or raises their hand.
I have to share a kind of little bit of a funny incident. About 30 seconds before the presentation, I noticed my laptop was unplugged. So you may have seen me rush off screen really quick to go plug that in very quickly. I was thinking about all the scenarios, including the worst case scenario of my camera cutting out midway through the presentation. So anyways, I thought I would share that little story here.
All right, any questions for our panel, or for our presenters, I'm sorry. So we do have just a technical question about the PowerPoints and if we are recording the training. So yes, I will be sharing the PowerPoints after today. It'll probably come out to you all along with a end of session, end of academy survey. So that'll probably be coming out on Wednesday. And we have shared all of the other slides as well. So I can probably do one large push out of the slides. And then we are recording all of these sessions, and we will send links to those once they are fully processed. It does take us a little bit of time to process the recordings. So we will be sharing that with everybody who attended, and then those video links can be shared with others. We have a question here. Can you talk to the idea of a judge or prosecutor being, quote, on the hook publicly for releasing someone to diversion who later commits a crime? It seems challenging to say, I knew the person was high risk and I released them, even though that is what we are asking them to do.
Sure, I can take that as a starting point, and Sean, obviously, jump in. I think we need to sort of reframe our language and understanding of high risk. And that's part of why I focus on the risk management strategies that are needed. High risk doesn't mean they will reoffend, and it often doesn't mean that they actually are even at a level that people think of. So there's a very kind of classic study that was done on what do people think high risk is, and people sort of guessed that that meant it was like 90, 95% less likely to reoffend. But in actuality, the category of high risk might have less than 50% chance of reoffending or of violent behavior. So I think part of what I think we need to do is actually just be more specific in what we're saying and what the results of a risk assessment say. So, you know, again, two things that I would say about that is to be specific in the communication that high risk means that the individual requires a higher level of intervention, but that high risk is in relation to other individuals, but that the actual absolute level of risk is probably lower than people think. And then also to normalize that the likelihood of something happening, it will happen, right? So, you know, unfortunately, or, you know, just to normalize that idea that there will be outcomes that play out the way we worried about them happening. I hope it's not the nightmare scenarios that Sean was alluding to, but that we are doing our due diligence through evidence-based assessment and really appropriate implementation and match with the risk-need responsivity model to do our best to ensure that those things don't happen. But yeah, I get it, and that is, I think, part of the job. It's also not to say, though, that if those individuals were in a facility, that those kind of adverse outcomes wouldn't happen either.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit everything I would say, and just to reiterate, I mean, I think this is, again, why it's important to be really clear in what we're saying in the risk assessment, and to be really clear in what we're not saying, and just to be, just to document that in a way that I think is, is clear and concise, and to just be really transparent in what we can and can't know, and just to really highlight the management and intervention elements of violence risk assessment. I think those pieces are really critical. And I also just echo Sarah's comment that, I think high risk, it means something very different, I think, in sort of most people's minds as compared to when that's been sort of looked at empirically, so.
Okay. And then Phoebe Bell, I'm going to unmute you. I'm showing that you've asked a question, but I don't see it in the chat. So I'm going to unmute you and see if you want to just ask your question out loud. If you do, tell me.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's kind of related to that last question. It's just, how do you kind of come to risk assessment agreement as a team? Like you have behavioral health, and you have judges, and you have district attorneys, and lots of different folks with different perspectives and different, public personas they have to, and kind of constituencies to be responsible to, and just ideas around how to work as a team on coming to consensus.
Well, I can jump in. I've done a lot of work around this in relation to diversion programs and also just pretrial release more generally, and it is work, and I think you need to bring those stakeholders to the table. But my experience is that when you talk and educate folks on what the actual rates of these behaviors are in the community, even amongst people that are quote unquote high risk, people are quite surprised. And so I would encourage you to talk about success and talk about the results of the assessment as informing, as I said, what you need to do with the people. So I think language matters, and it's really about saying and coming to like a community level of tolerance. But I would also just caution and say that part of that conversation should also be about people who are quote unquote too low risk, and that we would actually be making worse through the requirements of the level of intensity of services that we would have. So just to give a very specific example, I know that there's a lot of bail reform and discussion about pretrial risk assessment in California, and the actual rate of new violent crime during the pretrial period is incredibly low. And so there's this sort of disconnect with, and by incredibly low, I mean often less than 30%, less than 10%, sometimes even less than 5%. So these behaviors do not happen very often, and the benefits and the value and the positive impact of, pretrial release or diversion programs, often the communities can come together and realize that it outweighs or justifies that potential fear or concern.
Right, next question. If a client is arrested for a second serious crime, will you be talking later about how to manage these clients? What if a client fails the program and needs to go to Napa State Hospital after all? So maybe I can take this one on. So there is guidance in the penal code as to certain crimes that if they are committed while somebody is released on mental health diversion, they need to be revoked from the program. But then within each county, it really depends on the judge and the justice partners and what the agreements are. When somebody goes out into the community through the diversion program, it's a conditional release program, right? There is a treatment plan, and there are certain things that the person has to, attempt to comply with. We, like was mentioned a little bit earlier in this presentation, we do expect there to be, it won't be a perfect compliance necessarily, but then there are different levels of seriousness of how maybe they aren't complying with that program. And so for a second serious crime, it's really going to depend, is it one of those crimes that falls within the penal code that is supposed to be kind of an automatic revoke from the program, that fall within certain crimes that maybe your justice partners have decided are something that is going to immediately revoke them from the program. In some communities, in some of our programs, you know, for certain crimes, it's really, you know, the person just goes back to jail for a few days maybe to be restabilized, or goes into a higher level of care for a few days to be restabilized. And then, you know, they work on getting them back out into the program, and that's, you know, with the working with the justice partners to make that happen. If somebody is revoked from the program, so the state hospital question is kind of, it depends. So if you diverted somebody who is in the likely to be IST category, that means they haven't been found actually incompetent to stand trial yet. So they wouldn't be automatically committed to DSH. You'd have to go back through the competency evaluation process before they could be ordered to DSH for that second crime. If you diverted somebody from our pending placement list, so somebody who has already found IST, who is waiting to be admitted to a DSH program, when you divert that individual, we actually just released a instruction letter to our current counties, and you all will receive a copy of this as well, that outlines the process by which you flag those individuals who are on our wait list to us here at DSH and our patient management unit, and they will make a note in our system that we use to track all of this. And if that individual is ultimately revoked from the program and would go back to being committed to DSH directly, they would still retain their original commitment date. So they wouldn't, in essence, lose their spot in line to the state hospitals. They would, because we admit in the order of commitment date to state hospitals. So it depends. It depends on, like I said, whether the person was actually already found IST when you diverted them, or if they weren't. So it's going to be a case-by-case basis. Okay, another question. How often should a risk assessment be redone during the diversion period? Also, do you have links or sites to studies about recidivism, risk assessments, et cetera, that you talked about? It may help to provide those to judges and other parties to show what the research shows.
First, the second question, absolutely. I have all of those things. I can send copious resources. I've also been involved in writing guidance or primers for judges and lawyers specifically that I'd be happy to share out. In terms of the first question, and I'll make sure that Ashley and Sean and others have links to those articles and papers if folks are interested. The first question about how often a risk assessment should be redone during diversion. I will say that my personal guidance would be that, you know, every 6 months at the most. I really see diversion as a period of time where there is likely to be a lot of change in an individual's functioning. I would actually recommend quarterly review of their status. And again, it doesn't need to be a super in-depth several-hour evaluation. This can be just a quick check, like the guidance that Sean and I gave on that last slide about, you know, how are they doing? What's the same? What's different? What do we need to be doing differently? What do we need to continue doing? And from there, I would say, you know, at the outer limits, most guidance would say, you know, at least annually risk assessment needs to be revisited. But again, personally, I would plan for and create a strategy to revisit at least every 6 months and ideally quarterly. And then for that, you know, just really to be thinking about what other reasons might you redo a risk assessment. So I'd love to have a policy in place that says do it every 3 months or 6 months or even every year, but then also to say when it would need to be revisited outside of those parameters. So what I mean about that is if there was major change in the person's functioning or in their circumstances. So if there was a death in the family, or if they're no longer able to live where they're currently living, or if they're doing well and transitioning to a new setting, or, you know, some other kind of major life circumstance, because we know that those can either be very stabilizing or very destabilizing. So if we're saying that these are periods of change, well then my view is that we should revisit what that change is and how that might affect an individual's risk to self or others.
I totally concur. I think that is perfect. Yeah.
Okay, and that looks like the end of the questions for now, and we are actually a little bit behind on our timing. So I think we should move to our next presentation. I'm going to find Dr. Peinels and unmute you. So Dr. Peinels, you are unmuted. Take it away.
Great. Do I have to unblind my camera too? Am I on camera? Ashley?
Sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute. Give me 1 second. I just need to change it back to a panelist.
Okay.
The camera will come on.
Great.
So you should be able to activate your camera now.
So now I have to figure out how to do that. Bear with me, everybody. Many different, got it. I think we've got it.
There you are. I can see you.
Excellent. Great. Okay. Well, you know, I just really loved listening to the presentation from Sarah and Sean, and I think many of the things I'm going to say are sort of looking at things similarly. They pretty much are looking at them similarly, but perhaps from the angle that I see things at as a psychiatrist who's worked in these settings and worked on diversion programs and trying to build that trust. You know, there's a couple things that are really important just to emphasize in terms of some of the questions that came up. It's really good to have some wins, so to speak, to help judges and others gain the confidence of the process that you're trying to develop. And I think that's a really important thing from the beginning, and to help use that language around risk, not as a one and done kind of thing, or not as a label, high risk. I worry about that even with the label forensic, because I think it conjures up these images that then just get people wanting to do more oversight, and that's not always the answer. It's really about smart management that we're talking about. I also look at this from the angle of liability when I do malpractice case reviews as a subject matter expert. And a lot of times it boils down to just the things that Sarah and Sean talked about, and I'll get into some of that as well in terms of just assessing, and then thinking about management is really the goal. So let's go to the first slide. So as they said, the first thing you want to do is get a good sense of what the risks are that we're talking about. You know, this talk that I was asked to give today was about, managing violence in the community, but violence is just like the word risk. It means many different things. It doesn't have a clear meaning. You could look at somebody who takes a frying pan over the head of their roommate, which is a case, that I've seen, or you could have somebody who, pushes someone, or somebody who's using a gun. And so obviously each one of those scenarios presents different risk and different ideas around what constitutes quote unquote violence and risk. So the first important piece is to do that assessment of risk. Next slide. And I'm not going to go through all the things that Sarah and Sean went through, but in terms of understanding the screening for who's eligible for the program, that's going to be really important. And then thinking about this assessment that you're doing, which is not meant as a prediction. Remember that you can do a really good job with an assessment and with developing a risk mitigation strategy, and you can have something go awry. And it can go awry for any number of reasons. Take, for example, a case where you did everything you could, you assessed the situation fully, you did an excellent job, and then that person ends up with their spouse at home telling them they want to leave them and they're going to get a divorce, and being angry and threatening them. And, you know, that person may react to that situation. Well, that would have not been within your predictive ability to understand what the social context was going to be for that individual. And so let's say that person that you're working with ends up acting in a way that's aggressive in response to this very complex social dynamic. It doesn't mean that your risk assessment was wrong. It just means that some other things happened. So the art is really about thinking prospectively, not just about what you know, but what you should know to do that assessment. This comes up a lot in liability. It's not just about what you know, but it's what is your responsibility to know in terms of understanding the person's history, making those judgments to the best of your ability, and then carrying forward with those assessments to the best of your ability, and then applying those to how you're managing the risk. We're going to see a lot more coming out, and we have already seen research looking at specific types of aggression when we're talking about violence risk assessment. There's already studies looking at stalking aggression, looking at domestic violence aggression, and there are instruments that measure those types of aggressive moments. Sex offending is another example. And, you know, you can take an individual and parse out your assessment along multiple different dimensions and domains of risk to try and understand what the risk mitigation strategy is going to be. But the most important thing is that you're doing this screening and assessment so that you are informing your management decision making, and that it's not just a one and done, because again, situations can change. I'm dealing with a case right now where one of our individuals who has a really serious violence history from years ago has now a late onset neurological condition that's leaving him not quite quadriplegic, but very weakened. And the question is, does that completely negate, even if his mental state is still the same, does it completely negate his risk? So that's another example of why risk is really a moving target, and how people are doing and how you're managing it is really kind of a day-to-day thing. One of my favorite jobs I had was when I was a community mental health medical director, and cases would be presented to me on a weekly basis of, you know, this person has paranoia, and we know that they have a history of engaging in some aggression, but now the issue is they won't let us into the apartment to deliver groceries. They're talking to us on the phone, but we can't even have a conversation with them. So, you know, that's really a very basic part of risk management, becomes just these little nuances of how we're working with people to help them stay engaged and open to our trying to help them. Next slide. So what I would suggest, and this I think really does support what we heard about this frame is in aspects of the frame, is really looking at the risk differential diagnosis and which risk has which issue. So for example, somebody could be with chronic mental illness and a history of engaging in, let's say, an assault on a public safety officer because they were psychotic at a time. Now they're totally stable, but they're in a fight with a neighbor, and there's issues with their neighbor about playing music loudly, having nothing to do with mental illness. There could be medical things going on, like this case where we're dealing with an individual with a new onset neurological disorder. They could be having irritability related to their medications. They're dosing or they're on a new medicine and it's causing akathisia or instability and some extra irritability. It could be making them, they're on an antidepressant, it's making them hypomanic. So they may be having other things going on that shifts an aspect of their risk. And then, of course, the basic psychiatric symptomatology that got them into your diversion program to begin with, symptoms of mania, symptoms of psychosis, that may be in a quiescent period because we know that's the nature of these conditions, but are we aware of and can we pay attention to what are prodromal symptoms to be mindful of? For example, one individual I saw several years ago talked about the idea that when he was starting to get manic, he would find that he wasn't sleeping, he would start listening to music very loudly, he would start feeling like he was in subsidized housing, but he would start feeling like he had some authority over the subsidized housing of his neighbors. He started to believe he was the landlord, and then he started to believe that not only was he the landlord, but he was the mayor of the city, and then he started to believe that he was Jesus Christ. And that was like his trajectory of belief systems were getting more and more grandiose as he became more and more manic, and at the end stage of that is when he engaged in all sorts of behaviors that got to the attention of the police. And of course, by then he was so psychotic and manic that he just had lost touch with reality. So the issue is trying to understand the risk differential diagnosis for what's going on. And I know that means that for diversion programs, you're sort of paying attention to a lot of different aspects of people, and we don't want to over-supervise people, and we can't stop, let's say, the situation where somebody gets into a fight with their neighbor and gets angry. That's not something that, you know, is something we can control every day. And that becomes some of the challenges that we see in the work that we do. But yet, I think there's ways that we can help people manage anger, manage their situations through our approaches and thinking broadly around clinical services and how we support. And I really believe a lot of this rests on recovery principles, which are really about helping the people we're putting in these diversion programs live full, meaningful lives with maximum community tenure and with minimum disruptions in their care and treatment and lives. That means getting them to employment, getting them to housing supports, getting them the support that they need so that they can really stay in the community with less risk of recidivism criminally and less risk of exacerbations of their illnesses. Next slide. So then we move from risk assessment to risk management. Next slide. And you know, this goes to I think what Sarah and Sean were talking about. This is really kind of a way that you can look at it from a quality improvement, and we'll talk about that perspective, is that you're constantly engaging the patient and engaging the system of care around the patient while you're looking at hazards, while you're analyzing risks, while you're evaluating, ranking, managing, thinking about how the management strategy is working. Remember, I showed you data at our last Diversion Academy, for example. You know, if you're sending your case managers out to meet with somebody on a regular basis, but your case managers don't know what they're supposed to meet with them about, and they don't really have an agenda, then you're not really necessarily managing the risk in the way that you want. So really guiding how that management is supposed to work and the contextual factors that may be going on. And it is definitely an ongoing process, which is, I think, what makes, you know, supporting individuals in diversion programs really exciting and gives you that ability to form relationships for which usually at the end of the day, they can be very grateful, and it can be a really gratifying experience to work with people and help them manage their own risks as well. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about these four main domains today. One is treatment. Let's talk a little bit about effective psychopharmacology and other therapies, which can often be a linchpin of support of these individuals, but are not the only answer. Partnerships, we've talked about that. You've heard about that with Sarah and Sean, but appropriate supervision in the community, importance of communication between providers and the criminal justice partners, the importance of your own documentation for your own purposes, and then this idea of not just continuous risk management and risk review, but think of it as continuous quality improvement. What do you do when there is a serious incident? How do you accept that incidents are happening as part of the work, but continually improve your processes so that you gain trust and build better services with your stakeholders really at the table with you? Next slide. So I'm going to talk about each of these, and then we'll have time for comments or questions. So effective psychopharmacology and other therapies. One of the things that I see in cases that I review really around the country is that this becomes a real challenge for people to really be thinking about effective psychopharmacology. Part of the reason is because in community settings, you know, there may be some limitations to providers who have experience working with individuals that are criminal justice involved. There may be some hesitancy to do that. There's going to be co-occurring conditions with substance use disorders very often, and so you may not have the expertise that you need for medication-assisted therapies and how those work with other types of medications for primary psychotic and affective disorders. And so there may be a need for additional support around that psychopharmacology. And then, of course, you have issues with adherence that can be a real challenge regardless of how many times the judge tells somebody to take their medicine. And there can be lots of things going on for that in those circumstances. And then, of course, psychopharmacology is a wonderful tool to help people with illness get better, just like it is with diabetes and we use insulin. But we know that if you're treating chronic mental illness and if you're treating a chronic physical health condition, it's more than the medicine. Because even for diabetes now, there's lots of support groups, there's lots of working on illness management. We do have illness management and recovery for people with serious mental illness as a model that's similar to what we do with diabetes management or high blood pressure management. But this is part of the challenge, is recognizing that this is not just going to be short term, but really working with people around acceptance and other needs that they may have to support their success around their psychopharmacology. And then, of course, other therapies. Next slide. So when we think about psychopharmacology as a prescriber, there are different medicines that we might use to treat acute aggression and agitation versus symptoms of impulsivity versus mood reactivity versus psychosis, just to name a few. And so a good biopsychosocial review is going to be needed to understand what medications are going to be most beneficial for this individual, and then also review what they've been tried on to understand the side effect profile and what is most likely not just to be the best for them, but also to help them with the least number of symptoms that they may, or side effects that they may be experiencing, and of course the least number of symptoms. And then you're going to want to think about adherence strategies. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked to consult on systems where we have court-ordered treatment, whether it's through criminal courts or civil courts through assisted outpatient treatment, where the number one question is, how do I make somebody comply with the medicines that we're prescribing? And, you know, this is a challenge, and it is not, some people will, by definition, when you say a judge has ordered you to take medicine, will be more likely to take the medicine. But some people, that will not be sufficient. It may be that they have an ongoing concern about a side effect that they haven't addressed with their prescriber. It may be that they actually, you know, have problems with insight into their illness and really are not seeing the need for the medicine. It may be that they're forgetful. I mean, there can be many reasons why adherence doesn't work. Now, I know Sarah spoke about motivational interviewing, and I think that it's really important to point out that motivational interviewing is an evidence-based practice in the addiction space. There's actually mixed evidence about motivational interviewing with psychosis and psychotic disorders. There is evidence that suggests, for example, if you want to help somebody with schizophrenia stop smoking, motivational interviewing can help with that tobacco cessation. But nonetheless, people are working on applying some of these motivational interviewing principles to understanding adherence in the serious mental illness population. I think we need to go a little bit deeper than motivational interviewing strategies when we're talking about people who may have capacity issues in terms of medical decision-making and really rely on other ways that people look at decision-making now. For example, the concept of supported decision-making, which has really gained a lot of attention, I would say, starting within the intellectual and developmental disabilities community, but now also in the serious mental illness community. And that is really about helping people who have decision-making challenges make better decisions for them without making the decisions for them. And that's a principle that gets into person-centered care. And the more I work with high-risk individuals, the more I really have become a believer in this idea of the person driving their own successes rather than us trying to drive them for them, where we're just competing and at loggerheads. If you have somebody that's got a delusion and a resistance to medication related to that delusion, that is not going to get you very far. So what we really want to do is help people get to yes. And that's some of the principles that we want to work with around adherence strategies. Of course, if they need an alternative decision maker, a conservator, for example, then using that person also to guide the treatment, bringing the supportive team around that individual to help them engage in treatment and stay engaged in treatment. I think treatment engagement is one of our biggest challenges that we have in behavioral health when we look at these criminal justice overlapping populations. All right, next slide. All right, what about looking at these also from the perspective of non-pharmacological approaches? Well, we know that behavioral dysregulation has, again, many reasons for it. Behavioral dysregulation, first of all, could be completely driven by antisocial thought patterns where there's a disregard for social norms. That's true, but oftentimes behavioral dysregulation can be related to trauma, reactivity, hypervigilance, that type of response. It can be related to challenges in identity. It can be related to distress tolerance. And so we know that there are other types of therapeutic approaches that may be very beneficial beyond the therapeutic approaches or the cognitive-based strategies that are talked about in the criminogenic literature, but in the straight psychiatric literature, DBT skills, which can be used for people with maladaptive behaviors, whether they're directed inwards in terms of self-injury or outwards. Meditation, helping people with relaxation, supportive psychotherapy, trauma-specific therapies, and even engaging families in family-focused interventions where you have active families to help individuals, again, adhere to treatment and be wrapping support around them as opposed to simply wrapping coercion over them. And so I think these are the kinds of things that you want to look at as you're assessing the risk to understand what are the behaviors that you're trying to address and build your management plan into a supportive model that takes into account these types of therapies. Next slide. This just is a reminder that many of the people that you're going to be working with have high ACE scores, which means that they had early childhood trauma prior to the age of 18, which often means that their ability to attach to individuals may be thwarted. If you saw them as children, they may have been diagnosed with what's called reactive attachment disorder, but we don't use that diagnosis in adults. But what we see in adults is personality development that sometimes goes askew. And so where people that are fortunate enough to be held and fed and loved in childhood without violence and household dysfunction are more likely to have personalities that are more able to function in pro-social ways. Many of the people we're seeing are going to have these early adverse childhood experiences that's going to create difficulties in attachment, difficulties in relating to other people, difficulties in following what we would consider social norms. And so it's just a reminder to think developmentally about people and sometimes to not expect, even though we're working with adults, sometimes not to expect that fully formed types of interpersonal reaction, because oftentimes people are developmentally stuck at places where they haven't had better ability or examples. And many of these people that you're going to see in your diversion program have long histories of substance use disorder at early ages. They're going to have early onset of mental illness. They're going to have been in and out of institutional settings, which is highly disruptive. And now here you are ready to save them. Well, you're going to have to meet people where they're at and just take those issues into account as you're developing your risk management strategies. Next slide. So what we think about is really looking at what are the dynamic risk factors that you have identified in your assessment. Substance use, psychosis, anger at one's parents, poor insight, non-adherence, an unstable residential setting. These are all potential risk factors that you want to build your treatment plan around so that you're helping people manage their risk. And that could involve just really laying it out on the table around you know, for substance use, what substance use treatment are we in? Do we need toxicology screens to help people be better at managing their substance use and to help guide through some reality testing about whether they're still using? Excuse me one second. I have to shift positions here, sorry about that. You're going to also want to think about, you know, if there is psychosis, what are those medications that might be useful? If there is some issue around family dynamics, we know from the criminogenic risks and needs assessments is that you really do have these issues of family relations being something that creates criminogenic risk. So it is within the purview to sort of understand what's happening with the family dynamics, what can be done to help support that individual. Can psychotherapy help with insight? Sometimes gaining insight is not the goal. Sometimes getting better positive experiences is a more reasonable goal, because insight may not be so forthcoming for many individuals with serious mental illness. Non-adherence, blood level testing. Many of our medicines can have blood level testing to help understand whether it's being taken or not. And then unstable residential setting, helping build supported housing arrangements is going to be something that might be key. Next slide. So those are ways to really think about that risk management strategy. Now, what about partnerships between behavioral health and community supervision? Some of these slides are repeats of what I went over before, but I think it bears repeating as we look at some of the issues that we see in these partnerships that, you know, heretofore have been somewhat limited. Next slide. So this goes to the frame, I think, that Sarah and Sean were really addressing. And this is the idea that once you identify somebody's risks and needs, then you really think about deliberately planning, and this also comes from the Council of State Governments early work from Fred Osher and friends and colleagues, just really trying to integrate what that is supposed to look like. How does the behavioral health and the criminal justice supervision work together? How often do they need to have touch points with each other, let alone with the individual? Do they need to meet with the individual together? Do they meet separately and then confer about what happened? So these are some of the things that you should be thinking about as you're assessing the risks and needs of your individual participants. Next slide. Again, as Faye Taxman says, paying attention to stabilizing influences and really leveraging those stabilizing influences to help manage risk. Next slide. And then thinking about those destabilizers, destabilizing influences that might unravel somebody that you can help prevent and really pay attention to by understanding the history and understanding those needs. Next slide. This is an example of a treatment plan that we've used in some of our settings where we really pull out some of the criminogenic risk factors and the needs, and then really look at, on a regular basis, updating a treatment plan. So for example, sending somebody to, providing education, helping that individual engage in stress management exercises, sending them a referral to trauma-informed care. And really, the more you can drill down on saying, what do we want to accomplish this week, next month, the more specific you can be, the better off the plan will be, and the more coordinated it will be with the criminal supervision entity. Next slide. This is from a study coming out of Michigan that shows that the more we engage with people at those crossroads, the more likely they are to come back for treatment and come back for services. This was a study that showed that mental health treatment engagement within the jail really enhanced, I know it's a busy slide, it's hard to see, really enhanced the ability for the person to stay with treatment on the outside. So when you have individuals that are moving in and out of the jail, the other thing is to really maintain some of those relationships. In Europe, even, they have this concept, that's the other part of the slide, that really talks about this equivalence of care across settings and trying to make sure that there's no disruption in the care across settings. So that's, I think, another important point in the diversion programs. Next slide. Okay, documentation. Next slide. Documentation really should include basic content of your risk assessment and the sources that you use, and that does not need to be a forensic report necessarily. It doesn't need to be that detailed. For clinical purposes, you really need to just get your basic assessment information down and understand what sources you use. And then when you make decisions about where you're sending people or what you're referring to, you always want to document your reasoning of why and not just the decision in case there is an untoward outcome. You want to write your plans that really delineate those risk factors, sort of like I did on that one chart where I had the risk factors on one side and the mitigation strategies on the other. And that's always, you want to keep emotions out of documentation. All too often I see documentation where it appears that the behavioral health professional is frustrated with the criminal justice professional, or they're frustrated with the individual that they're supporting. And you can read frustration and anger in the documentation, and there is no place in documentation for that. It should be just the facts, just the assessment, and if you don't write it down, it didn't happen. If there is a bad outcome, you really want to make sure that you have that documentation. You also want to have consultation available, and when you do consult with an individual, you should be documenting that you consulted with somebody around the planning. And remember that your documentation is not just for liability management, of course. It's really to help you remember from week to week what your thinking was, what your planning is, and helps you communicate, assuming one provider switches over to another provider. It really helps with tracking and continuity for that individual. So it actually has treatment benefits to provide good documentation. Next slide. Okay, continuous quality improvement is the last area that I really want to focus a bit about. Next slide. So in the diversion programs that I've developed, in the reentry programs that I've developed, we always have an incident reporting mechanism. This comes from basic work for probably going back to when I was a community mental health medical director and beyond basic hospital care. I mean, you need an incident reporting mechanism. You need a way to talk about when something went awry, at what level the incident reporting mechanism is triggered, and who gets the incident report. So for example, in one of my programs right now, or one of the programs I work on, it's not my program, we have an incident reporting mechanism where we have a de-identified incident report that goes up to system leadership at all levels and then allows for an identified risk review conversation for the people that are more directly providing the care, and with a final report on recommendations without the specifics that can go back up to leadership. But you really do have to plan for that, because I think what that does is also allows that trust to be built across systems, so that the courts know if something's going on, so that your providers know, and that they know that you're invested in improving the outcomes that you've seen. And so these case review mechanisms are really important. The other thing that we've baked into all of our programs are prospective case reviews, and then of course retrospective case reviews for when there is an outcome that we didn't want. So the prospective case reviews, we asked our providers to present cases on a monthly basis just to discuss, and we asked them to pose questions. How do I engage this person who's difficult to engage? How do I think about getting the right medicine? And different, whatever questions they have, we allow an open dialogue with the other teams so that everybody's listening in and we can all learn together, and we actually ask the peers to help. Everybody jumps in to help problem solve with this prospective case review. It's great for team building, it's great for problem solving, it's great for identifying policy problems that you have. And then of course, similarly for the retrospective case reviews, luckily those don't happen too often, but it allows that mechanism for continuous quality improvement. And then finally, data examination and reporting. You're not just reporting your data up to the system and the state and DSH. You should be looking at your own data for your own quality improvement, and that's how you keep refining your system. Next slide. This is an example of a study that was looking at outpatient competency restoration, and I get that this is diversion, but you're really looking at a similar population. And what they found, and this is really what I want you to see as the last bullet point. This is from a paper where Neil Goensmith summarizes some of the data around the country. is what they defined as negative outcomes included arrests, elopements, decompensation, and serious rule violation. And it was interesting because even in their data, they found that there was only about 16.7% had any negative outcome. But of those, none were identified as serious. And the most frequent, quote, negative outcome was acute decompensation. Well, I think we're dealing with serious mental illness. So we have to assume that we will have people who will have decompensations, and then we have to help them adjust their medicine and get into the level of care they need, as Sarah said. Now, a quarter of them were for rule violations, but most of the time the rule violations were minor. And in fact, many times the rules that are set up, frankly, are silly rules. So we really want to think about, are the rules really valid from a treatment planning perspective, or are they just rules because we're used to this as a rule? I remember a case where we had a person that was sent for a 90-day residential program for his substance use. And at day 75, he had reconciled his relationship with his family. His father was willing to take him back in. His prior employer was willing to take him back into work. And he was really invested in outpatient substance use treatment. And the judge in that case said, but it hasn't been 90 days. And the probation said, but it hasn't been 90 days, so we're going to violate him for leaving the program early. Well, from my sense of a person-centered approach, violating him would have been just the opposite of what needed to happen. Here was a person, by every piece of data, was actually doing everything to mitigate his own risk that we were asking him to do. It just was done 15 days too early. Now, I get that you want people to get the full, quote, dosing of the care that they receive, but we really have to be careful about our own rules that we make up, and we really want to look at person-centered planning around risk management. Next slide. So again, management strategies for these negative outcomes really have to depend on the issue. How negative is the outcome? It might be hospitalization. That's not a bad thing. If I have a bad bout of with my diabetes and I need to be hospitalized, that's where I want to go. Reconsideration of the treatment plan. What do we need to readjust rather than have the person readjust? Do we need the stakeholders to convene to reassess that treatment plan and reboot it in a way that will be more successful? Because maybe we have failed in the treatment plan that we've put together. And I think that's a way to think about these issues. Next slide. And I think that was really all I had. So I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Peinels. All right, so I think we'll keep this kind of short, and if there are more questions later for Dr. Peinels, please, we'll open it up at the very end, but we are a bit behind schedule. We do have one comment in the chat that I want to read out loud. This is more a comment than a question. It says, along with your motivational interviewing approach, I hope the judge never orders a person to take medications, but always orders a client to follow the treatment recommendations of the psychiatrist, which may include medication compliance. It may be a slight change in wording, but it's important to always look to helping the client work in treatment with treatment professionals.
Yeah, I think that's a really important comment. You know, judges sometimes can overstep, but not meaning to. There's a lot of work done with judges now around making sure that they're clear about their orders around treatment. They may be frustrated because they don't see the medications working, or they may actually see side effects that the provider's not seeing. So that's why that fostering communication is going to be really key.
All right, any other comments or questions? If you want to raise your hand, give it one more minute, and then we'll go ahead and take our first break. All right, it doesn't look like we have anything coming in right now, but we will have opportunities to ask more questions throughout, and I do want to try to get us a little bit closer to our schedule. So why don't we go ahead and break for 5 minutes, if people can be back at 2:46 for our next presentation, and yes, we will see you all then.
And just a reminder, I'll be here till, I think, 4 o'clock your time today.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dr. Peinels. All right. All right, everybody. It is 2:47, and we're going to move into our next presentation with Ms. Katie Herman. Katie, take it away.
Thank you, Ashley. So yes, as you all know, I'm Katie Herman. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center, and I'm here today to talk a bit about how to prepare for adverse outcomes in diversion. As we've heard a lot today, the chances of things going very badly are very slim, but they do happen. So I'm here to talk a bit about that from my experience. Yeah, and a lot of this really dovetails really nicely with what Sean and Sarah and Deb have just talked about, but from a more kind of practical perspective, I guess. So this is really not meant to be any kind of cautionary tale or to scare anybody off about doing this type of work. It's really designed to be a transparent, honest discussion about how to plan when things may go wrong and when bad things happen, but also to think of kind of more philosophically and broadly about like what this work really is and what does it mean to do this type of really challenging work. As we've talked about a lot today and throughout this academy, this is a very high need, potentially psychotic, delusional, people that have experienced a lot of trauma, may have a history or actively using substances, and there will be serious incidents that happen when you're working with a population like this. I also want to clearly point out, which has also been mentioned already today, that as providers and as court stakeholders and as state representatives, we can do everything right, and bad things can still sometimes happen. So I'm going to talk a bit about a situation that I experienced when I was working on a Diversion Act team a few years ago as a social worker. I want to tell this story, but also provide a solution-based approach to possible challenges that could arise as a result of serious incidents occurring in one of your programs. So I was working on a Felony Diversion Act team. As a social worker, we had an incident that I would argue is probably one of the worst things that could possibly happen. We had a participant who, while she was in our program, she murdered her 1-year-old son. The situation, I mean, it rocked me. It made me question kind of everything that I was doing and whether, is this the right type of work to be in? Is this, what am I doing? What is our agency doing if things like this could happen? It rocked our agency, it rocked all of our team, our staff. But in the end, and I'll talk about this more, our agency did successfully navigate the situation. I mostly successfully navigated the situation, and we were all able to move forward. So I also want to preface some of this by noting that these are really hard things to talk about. It can be really scary and anxiety-provoking to talk about this and think about this, and for that reason, we don't usually talk about this, I feel like, as clinicians or as court stakeholders, because we don't want to imagine things like this happening, so we just kind of pretend that this couldn't happen. But then when that happens, then we act like that and things do happen, we're unprepared and it's chaos and doesn't help the situation. So again, really wanting to be transparent and honest as we talk through this. So I will provide a bit of context and introduction first. Of course, this is just a brief summary of this case, but this incident happened after the participant had been in our program for almost 2 years. Overall, she had done very well in treatment. She had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. She did have a history of very serious delusional and psychotic symptoms, but generally she was quite high functioning. She lived independently in her own private apartment. She had actually enrolled in and attended some community college while she was in our program. She had a supportive family and so on. She did have a history of multiple psychiatric hospitalizations before she entered our program and inconsistent treatment history. Her initial charge that brought her to our program was quite serious. She was psychotic and delusional at the time and believed there was some kind of evil force or evil forces stalking her family, specifically her aunt. in our client's mind, she needed to hurt her aunt very badly so that she would end up in the hospital, which would protect her and keep her safe from these demons. The client ended up stabbing and tasing her aunt in her apartment after she called her aunt over to her home. She was injured quite seriously and was hospitalized. The aunt was medically. Interestingly, her aunt did not support my client being prosecuted or incarcerated. She understood she was very ill and needed mental health services in the community as opposed to being incarcerated. You know, this client did have a history of violence even before that incident. She had thrown scalding water on her former partner during an argument. There were also a history of some less serious but other violent incidents. So it was understandably very difficult to convince the DA and the judge to release this client to our program. After a lot of advocacy, a lot of heated meetings, a lot of written evaluations and risk assessments, the judge released her to our program over the strong objection of the district attorney. And as I mentioned, she actually did very well in our ACT team services. She was able to express some insight into her mental illness. She developed close working relationships with staff, including myself. She was prescribed an oral antipsychotic medication that we provided her with weekly pill boxes, either during home visits or she'd come into our office. And as far as we know, she had been compliant with these medications. She attended all of her court dates and she was never rearrested until this incident occurred. In retrospect, and I'll talk about this a bit later, she was always slightly guarded with some staff, and she did maintain some symptoms of schizophrenia, like a flat affect, but she did not express delusions or psychotic beliefs to staff for the 2 years she was in our program. She had a history of marijuana use, and she was drug tested very consistently by our program, initially once every week and then more sporadically. She had never tested positive for any substances in our program. You know, for those of you who are familiar with ACT teams are unique in many ways because we're meeting clients in the community, in their homes. We get to know our clients' family, their friends. You get to know your clients in a different and a deeper way often than other forms of treatment. And I personally did feel quite connected to this client. I'd been with her from the very beginning. So while she was in our program, this woman began a romantic relationship which seemed supportive and positive. You know, the staff had all met her partner. He was involved in her treatment, like appropriately. They seemed to have a healthy relationship. She became pregnant about a year into our program. You know, at the time, our program psychiatrist did adjust her medication regimen when she became pregnant due to potential risks of taking psychotropic medication while pregnant. She was prescribed a much lower dose of an oral antipsychotic medication, and as far as we understood, she was compliant. She had a healthy pregnancy and gave birth to a healthy baby, and actually, when she was discharged from the hospital with her child, she had one of the nurses call me as her social worker to just let them know that she was being released. Most of the ACT team, including myself, had met her child many times during home visits. She brought the child into the office at some points. We never witnessed or had any suspicions that there was any abuse or neglect towards this child. There were no child protective service alerts or notifications, and she seemed like a very loving and supportive mother. As I noted, she had done well in our program, and when this incident with her child occurred, our agency was in the process of actually stepping her down to a lower level of service due to her engagement and compliance over 2 years. She was referred to a community outpatient clinic. She'd attended 1 or 2 intake appointments there while she continued to work with our ACT team, but she was meeting with our team less frequently as we, as the procedure went to step her down. But once this incident with her child occurred, things happened very quickly. As I mentioned at the beginning, thinking about this incident made me and our agency sort of question everything in retrospect, which is sort of what Deb was talking about earlier. What did we miss? What did we do wrong? Why is she taking her medication? Should we have put her on an injection? Should we have, asked her more pointedly if she was experiencing any psychotic symptoms? should she have been on an injectable medication? What could we have done to have stopped this? I grappled with these very philosophical issues, like, can good people do terrible things? Like, was she a psychopath? Your mind kind of goes off. Should I never have advocated for her to be released at all to begin with? Like, would this have prevented this from happening? But at the end of the day, and after many investigations and audits from the state, from a lot of different departments, which I'll talk about, they found that our agency did do everything we could. And while there were things we could have done differently in terms of her treatment in retrospect, overall, we did things correctly. I think one of the main things that also helped us a lot was that our agency had a really long track record of providing services to people with serious mental illness. Our agency had been around for a very long time. We had been doing this type of work for almost 20 years at this point. We had the majority of our cases had been very successful. So when this incident happened, we had a lot of really good things that had happened to kind of back us up. The judges, the DAs, for the most part, trusted us a lot. So that really went a long way, that rapport and kind of open communication and trust. So we had seen this client at home less than a week before this incident had happened. She had appeared stable and at her psychiatric baseline. Another very challenging aspect of this incident was that the incident itself occurred in the bathroom of a fast food restaurant with just the client and her child. So no one really knows or will ever know what happened. What we understand based on police reports and other mental health evaluations after she'd been arrested was that she admitted to smoking marijuana fairly consistently in the days leading up to this incident, and she did test positive for marijuana following her arrest. She reported that she had not been taking her medication as prescribed, and she, at the time, believed that her son was being stalked, again, by evil forces and demons, and that she needed to protect him before something worse happened. From what we understand, she had suffocated her baby in the restaurant bathroom. Staff from the restaurant eventually kind of had to break down the door and found her with her unresponsive child. Our client was arrested at the restaurant when she was brought to the psychiatric ER in custody for a psychiatric evaluation. She was actually assessed and cleared. She was not, she did not meet criteria for inpatient admission at the time, so she was transferred to court and then eventually to the jail after her arraignment. In less than 48 hours of this incident, our agency was subpoenaed for all the client's records by the district attorney, and the state began an investigation. All of our records were reviewed, staff were interviewed, etc. So next slide. So these are just a few of the main takeaways. A lot of this is just what Deb was saying, so I'm not going to repeat it necessarily, but so when the state was evaluating our progress notes, again, they were looking for things, and this is just, good clinical work in general, to have that golden thread that relates every single progress note to that treatment plan and that risk assessment, so that you can really see, like Deb mentioned, like what are staff actually doing when they're meeting with this client. So there shouldn't be a note like, I met with so-and-so and we talked about her going to school. And then the next note, I met with this person, we talked about her child's daycare plan. Like that, there's no like golden thread to what the treatment plan should be. And again, like Deb mentioned, there should be really clear interventions, not check-ins, not chats or things like that, like clear treatment interventions. Same thing, how is medication management being documented? If you're giving a client a pill box, are staff counting those pills during every visit? That all needs to be documented. Does she report taking medication? Do you have indications that she's not? This was a little difficult because she was on an oral medication. So we did believe and trust that she had been taking it because she overall seemed psychiatrically stable. And same with toxicology results. When we were subpoenaed, we had an internal database where we were able to print out every single toxicology result in like 2 minutes to provide to the subpoena that showed every single date that she had tested negative for over 2 years. So it was a lot of information. Next slide, please. So those were some of the clinical considerations. In terms of legal considerations, again, these are tips based on this experience from me. One is to really identify an agency point person so that when incidents like this happen, there's kind of one person in charge. That was something we didn't really have at the time. So there was, you know, like the CEO and the team leader and me, because I was like the court representative. We were all kind of handling this differently, whereas I think in retrospect, having like one point person for like serious incidents would have been helpful. You know, this incident actually got quite a lot of press at the time. We had the press reaching out to our agency, to staff, trying to get information. So really having a clear agency communication plan. We ultimately decided that our agency's like chief counsel was going to be that role and make it very clear to staff that that is the only person who should be communicating with anyone, but especially with press, just to make sure there's like a consistent information being shared. And same with, you know, developing some kind of press plan, some kind of statement. And again, these are all things that you should be thinking about doing at the very beginning, not waiting until an incident is happening when you're managing it and then trying to figure out all these things. And same for procedures around how to handle subpoenas, audits, things like that. I was subpoenaed a few months, almost a year later after the incident, to testify for trial as a witness for the prosecution, which again brought up all kinds of ethical and moral questions. So I met with the district attorney multiple times. We had our agency's chief counsel come with me. We'd had a lot of prep meetings. I was prepared to testify, and the client actually ended up taking a plea on day 2 of jury selection. So I didn't need to end up doing that, but you know, make sure that staff are aware also, like during your onboarding process, ongoing training, that in this type of work you could technically be subpoenaed to testify. Maybe you could do like role plays or something like that in like staff training or something. You can decide that on your own, but just something to be aware of. Next slide, please. And also, you know, staff support. I would really encourage, this is something we didn't do, but to develop a procedure for how to inform staff when a serious incident like this occurs, some kind of phone tree or email system. This is something we didn't do. I found out about this because a coworker of mine had called me in the morning and said, oh, turn on the news. And I did, and I saw this story right there. You know, that ideally was not how I would have liked to hear about this. And then, of course, word travels very quickly, and people are getting kind of different information and, you know, the developing story, but really have, like, make sure maybe the team leader or the, like, your agency's attorney or something have a procedure in place. Same for, like, some kind of emergency, not just like a serious incident, but have a plan in place ahead of time. Something our agency also did was they hired a clinical consultant to come in to help us both process what had happened as a team. You know, team building is so important, especially on an ACT team where you have to rely on, you want to, and you have to rely on each other for support. Having like an outsider come in, I thought could be helpful to kind of help with that processing. And also she was available for like one-on-one consultations, obviously free to staff. Because again, maybe you didn't want to talk to your like direct supervisor about this incident because it was almost too close, or at least that's how I felt. So having kind of an outsider already set up, I thought was helpful. Same in terms of supportive supervision for staff. This was, again, a very emotional, challenging thing that happened. So having supportive supervision while it's happening and ongoing was just really supportive, really important for staff. And same around time off. I mean, that can be really hard on an ACT team. You know, we had 70 other clients we were working with. We couldn't all just like take off and take personal days at the same time. But, you know, staff wellness, self-care is so important if you want to be able to do this work in an ongoing way. So trying to develop some kind of time off system so that staff can feel supported is really important. Next slide, please. And then just some other considerations that, again, you wouldn't really think about at the time, but thinking about, you know, in this case that I'm talking about was kind of unique because it happened in a public place, but my agency, someone in my agency thought, you know, we should provide some kind of referrals or support staff to those employees at that fast food restaurant who intervened and witnessed what had happened. So we offered some like referrals and some like general support, not us directly, but like outside support for them. Same for the participants' family members who we stayed in contact with for a bit. You know, because they also were going through a lot, and although of course they weren't employees of our agency, but wanting to do that kind of supportive work. Also, you know, something, you know, we wanted to be able to provide some kind of follow-up with this woman, some kind of termination. You know, at the end of the day, despite what had happened, like this was someone I really cared about. I still care about her, and she did deserve some kind of closure and termination. So I went out to the jail after the incident a few months later with my supervisor, which was helpful to have that support, to talk to her. Of course, we didn't talk about the case or what had happened because it was an ongoing open case, but you know, we had this really kind of deep, moving termination session. It was hard and emotional, but I was able to tell her that, you know, we were able to talk about our relationship and how far she had come in a lot of ways and how horrible this was. But at the end of the day, I did care about her and I cared about her life, whatever that might look like going forward. So at the end of the day, like I keep mentioning, we did everything right. No one lost their job from this incident. No one's license was revoked or suspended, which, you know, people had concerns about. Our psychiatrists had concerns about. Our agency was not sanctioned seriously in any way. The judge in this case actually continued to really be supportive of our program and work. He continued to release people to us that had very serious charges. He continued to trust us, you know, which meant a lot. I also just really want to reiterate, this was an outlier case. This is an outlier case. The chances of something like this happening are so low. The very, very vast majority of our clients did really well and were successful. And like we've talked about, success looks like a lot of different things. There were some people that agreed to take medication for the first time in their lives. Some people, you know, they weren't rearrested for a felony charge while they were in our program. They were sober for the first time in their adult life. You know, they weren't kind of there's always those outliers of success, those people that get a full-time job and they go to college while they're in our program and they never end up back in the hospital. And that's amazing, but that's not what success looks like for most people, in my experience. So also remembering that of course this case will always stand out in my mind. I will always think about this woman and this story, but also remembering all those people who did so well and are continuing to do well. And again, coming to terms with the fact that we did do as much as we could and that bad things happen, but you can move forward from them and you can continue to do this work in a really meaningful way. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm really happy to answer questions, talk about this more. I don't know if Sean or Deb and Sarah or Ashley have any like thoughts or feedback about this as it relates to this type of work, but yeah, I'm really open and happy to talk about anything now or offline, whatever people want to do.
So I just want to say, Katie, thanks for sharing that, because I think, you know, you get so many successes in these programs, but there are certain risks, and I think that they're rare, but you have to realize that we are working with humans, and humans are not entirely predictable, and not every bad outcome is preventable, and it's no different than clinical care. And so then it's sort of the why would I want to take on this risk? Mm-hmm. And you know, one is it's the right thing to do, and two is we're learning a lot more about strategies, and it can be super rewarding. But I really appreciate that you shared that story. You know, I think you can't be in the business of behavioral health, especially in the business of behavioral health and justice, without sort of your own war stories of things mm-hmm. that maybe didn't go the way you wanted them to go. And I would like to say that so many lives have been saved. In my experience, I believe so many lives have been saved from the mistakes that I made, because I learned a lot of really important lessons. Mm-hmm. Even if some of those mistakes were unpredictable and unknowable, but I learned them afterwards. And so I guess I think that's the bravery of doing the work, and I really admire people for signing on to this webinar and for you talking about some of those experiences.
Sure, thank you, Deb. No, I totally agree. So yeah, this really, it changed, in many ways it changed everything for how we did things, but it also didn't like sidetrack us so much, which I'm glad about.
And I guess another lesson that I learned in one of my hard stories was the transparency issue, is that the more you engage your partners in knowing and sharing the risk and knowing that you're not perfect and that the systems aren't perfect, and again, things can happen in people's lives that you don't know are going to happen. You can't predict everything. We don't have crystal balls. We're not magicians. We are doing the best we can with the tools that we have. But the more you're transparent, like if you're worried about something, or you know, you hire a staff who ends up doing something problematic, you know, you got to be out there and open to looking and self-examining what it is that you're doing, and then working with your stakeholders to problem solve together. Because I have seen programs that absolutely succeed despite bad outcomes, and I have seen programs that shut down because of bad outcomes. And honestly, in my experience, it's not the outcome as much as it's the trust mm-hmm. and the partnership that makes the difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I see Hallie has her hand up. Hallie, is there something you wanted to add?
Yes, did I double unmute myself successfully?
Yes, you did.
Okay, cool. Yeah, what Deb was just saying about the partnership really resonated for me. I remember doing a training on diversion with a elected DA who had a terrible incident happen in his jurisdiction for a diversion participant. And, you know, that's the position everyone, you know, is terrified of, right? And he said, you know, it was awful, but we had been working on those partnerships. We had been sharing information about our program, about how the decisions we were making were based on the best available science, and we wrote it through. He's still the elected DA because, you know, to Deb's point, that communication had been clear with the public, with the media, with other partners about how the program worked and why this one awful incident is awful, but it's one. So I just sort of tell that story to amplify what Katie and Deb were saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I didn't talk about this really, but you know, the day this happened, some of it was inevitable. Like I had to go to work that day, and I was in court, and I actually had a case in front of the same judge who released this client initially. And yeah, like I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to have to, but like the fact that and I'm not like bragging that I did this great job, but the fact that I was there, like willing to show up, and the judge actually called me to the bench. We just kind of talked a little bit about what had happened, and you could tell he had been traumatized, and we were all kind of like processing this together in this weird way. But yeah, being transparent and being able to have that kind of relationship and rapport really, I think, saved us and saved this woman in some ways, in a lot of ways.
All right. I don't see any other hands raised. I don't see anything in the chat. So I think what we should go ahead and do at this point is move into our breakouts. And I think we're going to change it up a little bit as we move in. So we're going to do a shorter breakout session for all of the teams. We're going to do about 10 minutes and just have you guys maybe discuss kind of your thoughts and takeaways and questions from what you have heard in the first half of the day today. And so either those questions can be asked of the broader group when we get past at the end of our session today, or if there are things we can't answer today, those are questions that can be sent in to us and we can respond to those also via email. So Sean, if you wouldn't mind handing me the presenter bubble one last time, I'm gonna just do one quick check. All right, everybody, welcome back. We're really excited for this next section. We have a couple of our representatives from a few of our different county programs who were able to join us today to talk to you about what it was like putting a program together and what it is like running one of those programs. So we're very happy today to have Ms. Leanne Cox join us from Del Norte County, Ms. Teresa Pemberton from San Luis Obispo County, and Dr. Mike Rodriguez from Ventura County. And as a bonus, Leanne is being joined by a recent graduate of their program, who is Leah, who will be able to perhaps kind of give you some perspective from the client side of things on these programs. So we're very excited and happy that they're all here today. I just wanted to give you all a brief little summary, very brief summary of these particular county programs, just so you have a sense of the size of the programs that we're talking about and kind of a context of where these counties are located if you're not familiar with them. So our Del Norte County program is a program it's going to serve 9 clients over the course of the contract, and Del Norte County is in the farthest north part of the state. They are on the border with Oregon and the Pacific Ocean. So they are the furthest north and west that you can get in the state. San Luis Obispo is a lot further south, also a coastal community just south of Monterey County. And our San Luis Obispo program is also contracted to serve 9 clients with us over the course of their 3-year pilot program. And finally, we have our Ventura County program, which is further south still, more in proper Southern California County, and a bit of a larger program. The Ventura County program is contracted to serve about 18 over the course of their pilot project. So, Sean, do you want to go to the next slide? So we have some questions that we've put together for our panelists today that we thought would kind of get the conversation rolling. And again, we would encourage you all who are participating to just start sending in questions through the chat that we will monitor. We will also open things up if you raise your hand a bit later. So Sean and I will just kind of go back and forth, I think, asking the panelists the questions to start off. And so I think the first 3 questions in particular are going to be directed to Teresa and Dr. Rodriguez, and then we will open up the last two to all of our panelists. So Teresa and Dr. Rodriguez, one of the first questions we have that we're hoping to speak to, and I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Leanne, would you mind muting your sound?
Do what?
Mute. There should be a microphone icon next to your camera icon. Perfect. There you go. You're muted. Thank you. So for Teresa and Dr. Rodriguez, the first question we thought would be interesting to get your perspective on for our counties is, knowing what you know now, is there anything you would have done differently during the planning or early implementation of your program?
I can go first.
Go for it.
So Mike Rodriguez, Ventura County. So I would say without hesitation, when I read that question, the very first thing that came to mind and hit me in the gut was we wouldn't have waited. I know talking in the monthly meetings, we fall into the same kind of pitfall that I think a lot of other counties did, where we really wanted to have a really good structured program, staff in place, and we waited and waited and waited, and before you know it, we're halfway into our grant and now more scrambling. I'll tell you that the reason why I wouldn't have waited, being the leader of our program over here, is we missed dozens of good candidates while we were waiting because they took other diversion deals or other deals in court, and they went on to have the same treatment. We ended up treating them. We ended up, putting them in our MHRCs or unlocked MHRCs, and then we kind of blocked all the spots for the next whole run of people because it takes, once you have a really good placement, a year or two to get them to move through and matriculate into the next lower level of care. So I felt like it kind of shot us in the foot to wait. I would say out of all the things that I can think about, not waiting until everything is what you think is perfect, because it's never going to be perfect, is to try to hit the ground running. Does that make sense?
Totally.
I think in San Luis Obispo County, we felt like we had communicated really well with everyone, but we could have done a ton more communication. The judges weren't understanding what we wanted about getting someone who's an IST into our program and how to do that. And we assumed that they had it, and they didn't. And so we had to do a lot more work with them. The other thing is we didn't initially work with the jail very closely, and what we've discovered is doing in-reach to the jail was one way to speed up the process. So we would be able to identify when people were stable on their medications and really ready to come out and jump into diversion. And so we work hand in hand with jail psych services to identify people, and then we bring that to the court and say, this person's ready, let's go. And that helps speed it up a little bit. So I think we do a lot more training with the attorneys and the judges on really what it would look like to have an IST person move to diversion.
Teresa, you are spot on. My point number 2, I'm going to read it. Should have provided a better training for court partners on what the grant is, who is eligible, who is not, asked them to be a part of the process because we had an existing diversion program running, created a lot of confusion bringing on our grant, and when everybody's on the same page, especially the judge, the PD, and the DA, the whole process runs way smoother. That sound familiar?
Absolutely.
Great. Ashley, should I go with the next question?
Yep. Go for it.
Sounds great. So this is another one of these, knowing what you know now. So, we have an audience, we have a group here of counties that are sort of thinking about all these things. Sort of knowing what you know now, what kinds of questions would you want to ask either yourselves or, ask like the experts, I guess you could say?
I think that I would ask if the attorneys actually knew what they were talking about when they were referring people to us. We went through a period where everything that was in court got referred to the program. It didn't matter what the crime was, it didn't matter what the charges were, it didn't matter if they had mental illness on board or not. Everything that went through the court system came across our desk as needing to be in the diversion program. I think if we had talked better with our attorneys as to what the program actually was, we may have avoided some of that.
That's definitely true, is making sure that the attorneys understand. We started out with trainings, and even with all of that work, one of the things that happened was we kept getting subpoenas for why we were saying we couldn't treat someone, even though we thought we'd made it perfectly clear that a denial wasn't a denial of, on a legal side, it was a denial saying we didn't have the services to treat that person. So that is a constant battle of trying to avoid having our staff subpoenaed because the attorneys are mad that we didn't bring someone in the program. So we do a lot of offline communication now with the attorneys. So you need to get to know your attorneys, your public defenders, your district attorneys. And now we can ask them to talk offline about the program and about how you don't want some of this information in the court record. If it goes to trial, that's going to be in the court record. So let's talk first before you take it that far. So I think we didn't expect to be subpoenaed when we started, and so we've had to learn to be more careful about how we say things. So I think looking back, that would have been helpful to know ahead of time.
And switching it up a little bit, just on the kind of nuts and bolts management of launching the program, a lot of us are the clinical folks, right? So I'm a nerd alert, I'm a dual licensure psychologist and MFT. So I've got my clinical hat on all the time, and I'm always, geared up towards treatment planning and what makes sense and what resources can we have, and how do we allocate them? And really what I should have asked was, what are the first 2 milestones in getting paid? It was months and months and months in. Our finance department and our director, my boss, comes in and says, hey, are we meeting the minimum criteria here to get our first paycheck? Maybe. Let me take a look at that part of it. I'm really good at the clinical stuff. And it kind of goes along with what the others are saying here with that language. We've got the clinical language down, but boy, you get into court with a few subpoenas and they start throwing 245As and 647Fs and I don't know what else at you. And it's important to remember to stick in your lane and ask the basic questions, the ones that we don't know. And some of the other basic questions that pop up and have popped up that I will ask and should be asked. Can DSH include support for involuntary medication on further expansions for the diversion program for the jail staff? It seems like we have dual grants going on at the same time, and I'm not speaking on the other grant, but our jail-based competency treatment program has been a smashing success with involuntary medication. So now the Sheriff's Department here in Ventura is much more apt to be open to that conversation, where a year ago they absolutely would not have it. And it's like, okay, maybe this is the time where we can start forging that path, because we get to, see people come in a very poor condition, very acute, and it would be so nice to not have to send them to a hospital or to try to figure out some emergency placement. If we could get them stabilized in custody, it would be huge. So asking questions like that, can we get support with the involuntary medication? Is there a path to conservatorship for the chronic terminated unsuccessfully clients? Those basic ones that kind of cross the clinical and legal realm.
I think the biggest problem that we run into with our jail is that we'll have everything set up for them to discharge from jail tomorrow. I'll go to meet them at the jail tomorrow so I can pick up their medications, get them into where they're going to be housed at, and they've already been released.
Ooh.
Because the jail released them at midnight instead of releasing them during business hours, so then I have to go and find them, which sometimes is successful, sometimes is not. We've had a few people that were released from jail early, and it took us 2 months to find them after they were released from jail early. So it delayed everything that they were doing, because now they're in the wind. I can't really say they're in violation of probation because they've never made it to probation to sign any of the paperwork. And people are like, well, we'll catch up to them again. They're not going anywhere because they stay in this county, but we delay treatment because we can't find them because they're released early. So that's our biggest issue with the jail. I don't know any way to correct it for us. I don't know if the other jails have the same type of problems, but do you have the same type of problems in your jail?
And I can kind of speak for Ventura and maybe new counties coming on, that some of the questions that you would ask. And I would say on that issue for Ventura, the watch commander, we can put a flag in the system for release, so that the watch commander, before the person is released, will call, it's me, but you can have them call a specific person in Ventura County. So the person won't be released until that person has been either verbally approved or somebody signs off for them. So we don't have that issue in Ventura at all. They will not be released without, approval from our program.
And that's in San Luis Obispo too. During COVID, that was happening. They were trying to get people out of jail, and we were losing them because they were letting them out too quickly. But overall, I think going back, what I would want to do in the beginning, in which we did pretty well, but we improved on, is have a relationship with your jail staff, your jail psych staff, with the jail, because they work with us. It's to their advantage that these clients do well with us. They don't want them in jail. So if you can communicate to them that by waiting and making a very smooth exit to a program, they're going to stay out of their jail. They'll help you. They want to help you. So developing that relationship with the jail is really crucial for success. So now they hold them until we get there. They don't let them out early. We make sure they have their meds. There are a couple of days of meds available because it takes time to get that filled. And that's smoothed out now.
Yeah, agreed. I think that's very important.
Yeah. We do have a question from the audience. It's very specific to this topic, so I'm gonna ask it now. So in these instances, and maybe this is more for Del Norte, is the judge ordering the clients released from jail, or is it the jail doing it? And are you getting clients out before they go to court?
We prefer them not to be out before they go to court because it allows us to interview them if they're still in custody. It's not the judge that's releasing them early, it's the jail. COVID was horrible because everybody that could be released was like out of jail. And it didn't matter. I mean, they still had sentences to serve and they were still released because of COVID. But it's gotten better now, because now the judge is saying, do not release this person. But for us up here, we are the site connection in jail. So there's no other person other than us in the jail setting doing psych services. And getting all of it on board without the jail still letting them go early has been difficult for us. But it is just the jail releasing them, because the jail determines who can go depending on their population.
And now for us, the judge is writing the order for release, and that they're ordered to be released to diversion. So that's the system that we've developed now over time. So if I could go back, that would have been the first thing, was they can't be released to anyone but us, because once they're out, you're going to lose them if they're not stable and have a stable place to go. So the judge writes an order that the person is to be released to diversion staff, and they don't release them until we have a bed.
Yeah, that's typically the same in Ventura. I think the only caveat is with our main judge for diversion, she'll release before she grants diversion to kind of give them a trial run, which is, it has its benefits and pluses and minuses. And we'd rather capture that time and the work that we're doing and not spin our wheels. At the same time, we're happy to get people out into the program. So, but it's similar, very similar.
So I think this all segues really nicely into our third panel question, which is, it can be difficult to get conversations going between the various partners involved in diversion. I mean, we've just been talking about the jail, the sheriff, the attorneys, the courts. Do you have any suggestions from your experience about how to get those kinds of conversations going?
We all meet. We meet before court. We have a meeting inside of the court that's with the judge, probation. The courts are there. The only person not there is the jail. but we do, like, I go into the jail twice a week. So I bring whatever I've learned from the meetings back to the jail when I meet with the jail staff. But that's the easiest way that we've had that conversation, because then we can also staff who we think might be appropriate, who might not be appropriate, and why. And it solves a huge amount of time for someone that we all know is not going to be appropriate for the program, but they're being referred anyway. So, and most of the time our attorneys meet with us, so does the district attorney, so that it's all a meeting about these specific clients.
In San Luis Obispo, we have a stakeholders group that is met from the beginning, not just the DSH portion, but all of our diversion. So that stakeholders group has the district attorney, the public defender, the judge, the jail, probation who does some supervision. So we have all those people in a stakeholders group, and we meet fairly often, probably quarterly. Less often as we've gotten established now, but that's where we can really talk about some of the issues. And in the beginning, it was priceless because we had such resistance from some of those stakeholders in the beginning, and they got to be a part of the planning, which gave them some buy-in and helped us move forward a little bit quicker.
Yeah, in Over Ventura, we have that kind of two-prong approach. We meet monthly for our mental health diversion leadership group, which is like the public defender, the district attorney, a representative of the sheriff's office, probation, and our two judges along with mental health. I don't think I'm forgetting anybody in there. So we meet monthly and discuss, kind of the ground rules that everybody agrees on for the general diversion program, and then kind of the grant diversion program also. And then the other thing that I would mention, like starting out, is you really need to have a consistent person that has some kind of authority in court regularly. So somebody who can make decisions. For us, it's me. I'm in court, and it's a drag. I mean, I'm in court 4 days a week for the county, and it's a huge commitment, but it irons out so much. So the judge has a good relationship with us, everybody, all the partners, and then with going into the jails, I don't know if they're at all the jails, but we have a TIM unit, Therapeutic Inmate Management Unit, and I think we house up to 160 inmates in that mental health section. And knowing all of those staff, because they're all trained and they really handpicked a bunch of officers, and they're the ones that kind of matriculate the inmate patients through from reception all the way through to when we release them. So it's just super important, I think, to establish that kind of solid relationship with all of the partners and make sure that everybody's on the same page. With that leadership meeting that we have once a month, we had a really good example in court today where a crafty public defender came up with case law and said it's not allowed by case law to have search terms in mental health diversion. And the judge quickly said, oh, well, my notes here from our diversion meeting, your boss, the public defender, agreed to this as a part of our program. Otherwise, I wouldn't be comfortable letting this person in the program. So you should go talk to your boss. And I thought, oh, this is working. Our meetings are working. So yeah, that communication is crucial.
Yeah.
I know another thing that works for us very well. It works for me anyway, because I do the reports that go back to the court. Our probation officer sends out an email to all of the parties that are participating in the diversion program with the testing results. So for each person that we're having drug testing, if that person has tested positive that week or the last week, I know at the beginning of the week because probation sends out a notice to say what their test results were, so that then we have a chance to talk to them not just at court, but before they get into court, to find out what's going on so that we can determine, okay, do you need a higher level of treatment? What's going on here that you've gone back to old behaviors? I don't know if the other probation officers send you those results, but it's helpful for us. Because then we don't have probation going in the middle of court, well, why are they testing positive, when we're like, I don't know.
So one other thing that I think we didn't have in place right at the beginning was sort of this idea of kind of a decision tree. And what we did was we ended up taking clients that were had some pretty severe developmental delays because they were really pushing, you've got to take this person, you've got to take this person, and so we did. But our services don't really fit all of those needs, and so it wasn't fair to the client because they weren't doing well, but it wasn't because they were bad or are not responding. It's just we didn't have the right services for them. So kind of that risk needs responsivity type of idea. We don't have the resources to help that level of deficit. So we had to really sit back and look at that. And we're in an integrated program, so we treat the substance abuse. But when you get someone with severe substance use disorder, they're going to blow out super fast because they need either residential or a higher level of care. So you've got to be really careful who you let in because they can disrupt it for all the other clients.
Yeah, I can echo that. We had a dual diagnosis person that, because of COVID, we couldn't get through our crisis residential treatment and went straight to the dual diagnosis residential program. And she blew out, and it stopped us for probably 3 to 4 weeks before we could get another person in there until that the trauma was gone from their referral process to let us go again. So that's absolutely on point. Hmm.
All right. I think before we go on to the next question in our pre-panel questions, we do have a couple more questions coming in from the audience that I think are more in tune with these earlier questions. So I thought we could go through those. So the first one is, how do other counties define successful completion of diversion? And do other mental health or behavioral health departments give a recommendation to the judge when it comes to suitability for diversion? So I think within your counties, what does that look like?
Our recommendations go to the district attorney, the client's attorney, and the judge in our county.
That's how it is in our county. The judge makes the final decision. We send our recommendation, what we can and can't do. Probation sends a risk assessment, and then the judge is ultimately the decision maker.
And over in Ventura, we a little different process, a little more exciting, unfortunately, where we have we've, right or wrong, taken a stance as behavioral health for Ventura County with short staffing and not having the budget for a normal diversion program. We don't do any private evaluations. We don't do any evaluations for non-VCDH clients or inmate patients, which has forced the public defender's hand to go with a private company that provides really fancy and well-done reports, honestly. But those reports, now they're out of our hands, so then they get they put their motion forward with the treatment plan, with the assessment, with the risk assessment, everything all together as a package. The DA gets to oppose, they duke it out in court, and then the judge brings us in and asks, okay, what can we do with them now that I agree or not agree? And then it's another iteration of duking it out because they still don't agree. But that's kind of the way it goes in Ventura. I think on the non-diversion side, there's about 100 to 120 overall people in the diversion program at one way or another. And then on our grant side, we try to snag as many of those referrals coming through as possible. So our referral process will be short up, but yes, another thing we could have done differently.
And then how do you guys define successful completion in your counties?
A bus ticket to San Luis Obispo. Just kidding. Totally joking. Now for us, it's for the we haven't gone far enough for our felony diversion yet because we dragged our feet and it's a 2-year process, and our judge is pretty much a stickler on the 2 years is 2 years. But we have had other graduations for diversion, and it's defined as, really getting better, getting well, spending your time, and then having your attorney petition the court to have everything dropped. And we're in our mental health court program, we have like formal graduations with like a gift and a certificate and everything else. In mental health diversion, it's been less pomp and circumstance, but really more kind of community support. So we've exited people through the program successfully and you know, made it publicly known and allowed family members to come even during COVID. But the success is remaining engaged in treatment and not reoffending for the term, whether it's 1 year or 2 years.
That's the same for San Luis. We've kind of set it up like a treatment court, so we have phases, and each phase has some expectations, and so it's stability, medication compliance, any of the challenges that would set them back quickly have been addressed in some way, some supports put in place, and then we let the court decide. But the court's gonna, at this point, the court sees it as if they haven't reoffended, they're going to be granted that they have completed.
We also have ours set into different phases. Part of what it takes to graduate in Del Norte County is that if we've said you need to participate in the AOD program, you need to participate in the IMR program. You need to complete those 2 programs so that you've done those 2 programs and gotten your certificate of completion through those before the end of your year. We recently had a gentleman that was extended for 2 months because he had a medication change just before graduation, and our judge wanted to make sure that the medication change was going to be good for him so that he didn't fall back into crisis. But ours is usually, did you jump through all the hoops of this phase? Have you continued to test clean? Is probation on board with saying that we're good to go with graduating you? And we've extended some people past our first year if they're not ready to graduate, so that they stay in the court for a longer period of time.
I think it's an excellent point, and that's also in Ventura. We've had people that have really utilized a very high level of resource, like an MHRC or another lock setting, done really well for a while, but then had a stumbling block once at a lower level of care, and we've had our judge pause diversion, and it would extend, you know, 3, 4, 5 months, but not completely remove them from the program. And I think that's important because some of these clients are very, very difficult clients, and it's better to have them in treatment than to exit them if it's possible. And the judges have been, in Ventura County at least, amenable to that.
All right. Another question. What role, if any, does probation play? Our probation hasn't wanted to be involved because diversion is pre-plea.
Yeah, we definitely had that argument very early in our process. Our probation department, you know, said they didn't have the legal authority, that there was every argument made to not be involved. And I understand where they're coming from. And it was really that team leadership meeting, the monthly meeting, where the judges pushed hard and said, we want you here, or we're not really willing to do the program. Let's work with the sheriff's department. Let's work with our legal counsel, everybody's legal counsel, and let's see what we can do. And for Ventura, I know it'll be different for every county, but just to give you an example, for Ventura, the judges feel that they will not have probation arrest, even if a person has, you know, tested positive for drugs in the community or substances. They won't have them arrest because they don't feel that they want to put probation in that pickle, that legal pickle. So if somebody violates while they're out, they have to be violated by either police, sheriff, somebody else besides probation. The probation party is really testing, reporting, just holding the terms together and being kind of the glue of the court. We love our probation team, love having them there, but that was a compromise everybody's willing to have to get them on board.
For us in Del Norte County, our probation team is great. They're our teeth. They actually recommend sanctions when a person's not doing well, and the judge will order that person into court while they're in the court process, because probation's 100% on board with our program. They come to court every time we go to court, and they are actually the ones that say in court, we're recommending is a 2-week sanction for what this person's doing. I mean, it doesn't always start at 2 weeks. Sometimes it's 24 hours, but it goes up in time very much like they would in the treatment courts. And they're that involved with our they send out the reports each week that tells us who's testing positive, who's not. And if they're going to recommend a sanction, they'll put that in the report that they send out to us.
In San Luis, very similar to Ventura, they were opposed from the beginning because there was no funding for it. They didn't want to do that. We were able to write another grant to fund probation, which brought them on board, but they're a huge part of our team, and we utilize them for identifying when a client's not showing up. They can go out and find them in the community and find out what's going on and check on them. Add a little bit of teeth in a way that there is somebody that's going to look for you if you stop coming to treatment. And they go to court with us each week. They're a big part of it, and I think, again, in our stakeholders meeting, that was where that pressure, the judges were providing pressure, the district attorney was pressuring, they were wanting them to be included. So that was a big piece of our planning process.
And our probation has grown with the program, and not a grant program, but our overall diversion program. So we started off with one dedicated officer, and when we reached that 40 or 50 mark, we have another dedicated officer. And now that we're up probably just over 100, they're talking about how to divide the caseload up, but to keep it consolidated enough that it's the same person in court. So currently our courts are on Mondays and Tuesdays, and both officers are via Zoom in court. The rest of the team is in person in court. So it's nice to have everybody together. Everybody kind of knows the caseload, and it's really nice to have probation with their fingerprints on these cases.
All right, and we've got one more question from the audience, and then we'll pivot back to our panel questions. So this has to do with whether or not, this is a multi-part question, but this audience member wants to know if either any of the three counties have a specific, like a diversion court with a specific calendar for diversion. And if you do have, I guess, a centralized diversion court, does that court also include mental health diversion for clients who aren't specifically for the DSH program only, so like misdemeanor clients or clients that would have other, wouldn't meet the DSH eligibility criteria, but would go into another program?
We have a separate court that's just the diversion program.
And for Ventura, I kind of alluded to it. We've got mental health diversion on Mondays and Tuesdays in one courtroom. So courtroom 13 is on Mondays and Tuesdays, AM court. There are only diversion, for the most part, only diversion clients or potential clients being called into that courtroom for that time. And just like probation, as it grew, it's still one judge as a primary, but we had people who had conflict with that judge, from past, whether it's juvenile hall or other past things, so they papered her. So now we've got a second judge who picks up about, I'd say, 15 to 20% of the total caseload in a different courtroom, but they do it at the same time on the same day. So we're kind of split, and it's getting more complicated, getting trickier, but it's between the felony and misdemeanor caseload, where I'm talking about 100, it's almost 50-50 with the breakdown there. And then we have private providers and public providers. So again, it breaks down probably 60-40. 60% of the clients are probably behavioral health clients, and 40% are private providers like Kaiser's or Beacon or some other kind of provider like that that satisfied the court with the treatment plan. So it's a very complex system. And just to kind of give you an idea, if anybody's wondering, we're building a forensics program. So we have mental health diversion on Mondays and Tuesdays. We have mental health court, which is a post-plea program on Wednesdays. We have our felony 1368 incompetent to stand trial program in courts on Thursdays in the same courtroom, and our misdemeanor 1368 on Fridays. So for the County of Ventura, we've got 5 solid days of court with, somewhere in the ballpark of 250 to 300, inmate patients that are always being served by us somehow. So it's a very vibrant population to be served.
San Luis Obispo County is much smaller, and so for the actual sentencing into diversion, that's done in the predisposition courtrooms or in the other courtrooms. And then once they're in the program, we have a specific judge and a specific courtroom that sees our clients in the different phases. So we do it separate from our other treatment court programs, which are seen by the judge in the morning, and then our diversion clients see the judge in the afternoon.
All right. Thank you so much. I've been like taking so many notes. Those are all really interesting insights and great information. A question a lot of people have, it's a question I definitely had when I started doing diversion work. What does an average day look like in your program?
And of course, it's going to vary on which level of staff or what kind of staff you have doing it. Just as an idea, I'm picking up probably half of my day or my work week now goes to the grant diversion program as we staff our program. But a typical day is, you know, answering emails and reviewing court updates from like 7:30 to about 9, walking over to the court. I have an office very close to the court house. From 9 to 11, I'm in court, duking it out with the parties. I visit our 10 unit right after court because our main jail is connected to our courthouse. So I walk over, go up to the level 3 there with our 10 unit, talk to all the officers, get the lowdown on, you know, who's doing well, who needs help, what kind of resources we have there, if they flagged anybody kind of referral-wise. After that, have a little bit of lunch, come back, review the medication compliance and reviews at the jail level and the jail medical, which is separate to custody. And then it's usually around 2 p.m. I'm ready to start my clinical day, and then I'll go around and you know, go work through my caseload on who might be a good fit for the program, who's on the waiting list for the program, you know, and kind of share the love throughout the jail there, and try to, if anybody's, we have 2 jails in Ventura, one out in Santa Paula, one in Ventura proper. It's very difficult to get out to Santa Paula. The entire system is different. So we try to bring them into main jail as soon as we know that there's a good chance to have them there. But I'd say that's an average day, and that's what we're hoping our line staff will do when we hire them and get them all trained up.
In San Luis Obispo, we're much smaller. I love that you have all that right there. I'm jealous. We do very intensive services, and so a case manager is very involved. All clients get a case manager attached, and they see them at least 2 times a week, if not more. They have groups, they have a therapist, they have a case manager, they have a med manager who then does a medication management group, teaching people to have a voice and speak up for what they need and how to talk to the psychiatrist, all that type of thing. So our clinic is really busy and hopping. There's always someone coming and going. Again, we're integrated, so the psychiatrist is here. We're monitoring if someone's decompensating. We get them in front of the psychiatrist that day. It's just very, very treatment heavy. Intensive services, that's what we are. We're IOT. So that's pretty much what ours looks like. We have a person who's in court in the early predisposition courtroom, which is how it's set up in San Luis, and we have a staff member there who's monitoring who's being referred to diversion so that we can set up a screening.
Del Mar County is even smaller than that because all of our stuff is done on an outpatient setting. So they'll come in for groups on Tuesday and Thursday. They'll do an AOD group on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. They see a case manager once a week. If they're set up for the therapist, they see a therapist once a week. They're not required to go to the therapist. They do med management. We usually will do med management as a case management appointment so they can bring in their med box. We go over their med box with them. I help them understand why they're on each of their meds. I think that it makes them more compliant if they know what each of the meds does for them. They know that we do the reports on them every week when they go to court. So getting them to jump through the hoops isn't as hard because they know if they're not coming to my groups, I'm going to tell on them. I mean, that's basically what it's about. So getting them to come to group is easy. Our biggest hurdle has been housing. We don't have a lot of housing options. So some of our people are in motels, and it's expensive, but when you don't really have any housing options, you don't have any housing options. We have one sober living program for men, one sober living program for women. They're always full. And then we have nowhere else to go, because for them to get out of jail, they have to come out of jail into housing. So I wish we had the residential programs, but we just don't have them.
Yeah, housing has definitely been a theme that we've talked a lot about during this Diversion Academy, and so I appreciate you bringing that up. Any other comments before we transition to that next question?
I think that was a perfect description of what it takes in a program. It's the relationship, it's the connection. So the two stories that come to mind for me of our first couple of graduates was the same thing. The first graduate said to us, after about 3 months of not talking really, stopped in the hallway and said, you know, no one ever cared before when I got out of jail. I'd get arrested, I'd go to the state hospital, I'd get restored, I'd be released without housing, without anything. And then, of course, he came back and he said, you guys really care. You're like helping me. Why? I don't understand. It was the relationship. And he has done phenomenal after cycling in and out of IST for years and years and years. He's with family, working part-time, doing really, really well. But it was that awareness that nobody ever cared before, and you guys did, and he was successful. So that mirrors that story you were telling of why it was successful. So I think that's a big piece of it.
I can share over in Ventura. I've said that we haven't had any graduations yet, but you know, some of the stick-out or stand-out stories, one of them in particular, I had been called into the jail for an emergency in the middle of the night. It was unrelated to diversion, but on my way out of the jail after working with that crisis, in reception, the watch commander asked me to take a look at a person they had. He was really confused what to do with him because there was an actively psychotic young man in there and definitely having a hard time. And, intervened, flagged him for mental health diversion, and he goes through the process. And many weeks later, a few months later, in court, that same young man came up to him in court and said, "Oh, hey, doc, hey, I got a job," and he showed me his name tag and everything else. I didn't know who he was. And he said, "Yeah, you remember, you met me in jail in the middle of the night." And I was, oh my gosh, I couldn't believe, my eyes that what a turn of events in just, 6 or 8 weeks or so, from going from, active psychosis to being medicated and stable in the community and, being proud to show that you're working. I mean, it was really heartfelt, and, I hopefully didn't jinx him because he's doing really well. but that was a success story that brought it home for me. I mean, I'm just like all of us, I'm very passionate about the work that we do and about the population we serve. And when I hear that, a lot of times when participants say, "Oh, you care," yeah, we care. We really do care. It's in there. I can't imagine somebody doing this job if you don't care, truly care.
So Teresa, did you have any kind of, I guess, lessons learned with like the billing with our department?
Okay, now I can take you.
There, is that better?
Yeah.
There you are. That's like Leanne, that's our fiscal department, so I didn't have much interaction there, but I do know it was hard in the beginning, but the whole DSH program was new for everyone. So on DSH's side and on our side, it was a huge learning process. I think just, if you follow the steps and do what you need to do, because I have not heard anything recently, so I know we're on track.
Yes, you guys are doing fine. And I can just add to a little bit to like what Dr. Rodriguez is saying. So I think one of the lessons learned for us at DSH, because we haven't worked in counties before, so we don't really know how those processes work, and this is our first foray really into working directly with county behavioral health and the community, and doing this type of programming. And so we didn't realize that, I think we didn't realize that the expectation would be, from like county perspective, when you're in these programs, you're typically going to invoice for services rendered, right? Your actual expenditures. Our program is very different. We have what we hope is a simpler, in a way, process of you just have to meet client benchmarks. You have to get a certain percentage of your contracted population in. And once you get those folks in and they're in for 30 days, then like say your benchmark is to get 2 clients in, and you get 2 clients in, they've both been in for at least 30 days, you can bill us for that benchmark, whatever that benchmark happens to be. So, so there was a little bit of confusion on both sides, I think, in the beginning about how to communicate it and how to do it. So, but you know, I'm here and my team is here whenever anybody has questions about how that piece works, and we're more than happy to set up a call to go more into the nitty-gritty details of like the fiscal piece of it as well. So please.
I think I would say, I think I can say that it's been really easy to work with Ashley with the whole DISH program. It's been super easy. They're very responsive. They answer questions. It's been, that part's been fantastic.
Agreed.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. I'm gonna go back through. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, so we're coming up on 10 minutes till the end of our session. I'm gonna do one last call out, see if anybody wants to raise their hand, ask a last question.
Is that question an answer question from earlier in the training?
Sure.
No, I'm wondering. I clicked on the question and answer, and there's one in there. So can you talk about how to work with partners to come to a similar expectation on someone's risk profile? Mm. Is that from something else, or is that one of ours?
I did not see that question. It might have been sent just to you.
It looked like it was on the top, I think. Oh, okay.
Maybe I missed it. Oh, thank you. Okay. Sometimes
we may all assess risk differently. So in Ventura, we definitely have our like I had mentioned, there's one company that does a lot of evaluations for the PD's office, and their standard is pretty much always including an HCR 20 risk assessment. I know each county has their own idea of where to go. We as a county do HCR 20. I'm certified, and so is my boss and some of our staff. So that's kind of a common language we can speak to. And we have had situations with the grant specifically, but also with the general diversion program, where when the parties don't agree, we have stepped in as the county entity. It's kind of a non-biased. Okay, we'll run our own HCR 20 and you know, make a recommendation, and that's usually solved any problems we've had.
For us, we have to go to battle fairly often. Often the DA's office does not want to offer probate diversion, and we will have enough history on the client that we really, really believe that this is the direction to go, and so we just start talking and negotiating. The flip side too is every PD wants us to take every client they refer, and often it's just not the right fit. That's not really what the program's for. And so we have to fight against that as well. So it's sometimes we do have to kind of go to battle and share what knowledge we have and all of those things. We do have they have an outside psychiatrist or psychologist that does the assessment for the public defenders, and often that person's done a record review and met the person maybe for 10 minutes and not done due diligence, and we know way more than they do about the client. And so often we see risk where they didn't see risk, and then we have to find a way to get that through to the court. So that's always a challenge for us.
We've had several where the PD's office and the DA's office are just, you know, two peas in a pod, they agree, and then the judge comes and sideswipes everybody and says, oh, no, I'm not letting this person in, and everybody's, you know, kind of like, what? Raised eyebrows everywhere. So it's still a process, you know, still working together, still, you know, going to battle, as you say, same kind of thing. And with risk, our DA's office is really kind of now fallen back on the HCR 20, and they do, I think they trust behavioral health because we don't do all of the evaluations for that second opinion. So there's a little separation there. And I think with, you know, especially if I knew this, you know, rolling out, I wasn't as familiar with the court process and the public defender's office as I am now. But if I had known, like, just to give an anecdote real quick, we had a case that just was borderline very risky, made everybody nervous, but everybody wanted the person to be in treatment. And overall, it dragged on for weeks and weeks of continuances and a malingering evaluation and an HCR 20, and then to bring in a specialist on something else. And then in the passing in court, the public defender that was really pushing for it told me under his breath, God, I wish the judge would already, you know, deny this one so that we could just move on. And I thought it's so funny because the face they put on in court is, oh, this person has to be out, has to be on the street. And then, you know, when I questioned the person on it, they said, oh, there's no way this guy belongs in diversion. But I'm doing my job. Like, oh, man, got to stay in my lane, got to be clinical, not get biased by the outside parties.
Excellent. Thank you guys for catching that. I'm having some technology issues over here today. So I want to say thank you to everybody who participated today. Thank you so much, Teresa. Thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez. It was amazing hearing from you. I always learn something new, even though I've been working with you all for a couple of years at least now. And I know that our audience appreciates it as well. We have some comments coming into the chat saying thank you and that they really appreciate hearing from you all. And I think this was exactly how we wanted to wrap up our session, letting people we've been talking about how to put all of this together and do this planning and think about your implementation. And we really wanted to round it out by having some people who've been through it here to talk about it. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. I think we will move quickly through our wrap up. And I know Katie has an announcement that she wants to make about some upcoming training that's going to be open and available to everybody related to housing. But I just want to let our participants know that we will be sharing slides from today, like we have for all of the other days. Also, we will be sending out a brief survey just to get some feedback on the Academy from you all so we can improve for next time. We will be releasing the recordings of all of our sessions as well as soon as we wrap up processing those. It does take us a little while, so I'm hoping we will have it out in the next week or two. And then also for the county audience, the new counties, we will be reaching out as well to see if your county is interested in any one-on-one sessions with us here at DSH and the CSG team. So be on the lookout for those emails as well. And I think, Sean, if you go to the next slide, we can hand it over to Katie just to wrap this up.
Thank you. Thanks, Ashley. So yeah, just briefly, I mean, again, thank you all so much for all your time and focus during these last 5 sessions. Like we talked about, housing is such a big issue for diversion. We had our whole day 4 around housing. Thomas and Charlie, who you met during day 4, are now launching this new webinar series to focus exactly on that intersection of behavioral health and housing, not specifically for diversion, but I think it'll be really applicable to many of you. So here's the date, and there's links here. You probably can't print the links here from the slides with registration, but they should be in the slides that Ashley sent, so you can register. It's going to be really great, so we're really looking forward to get that running just in a couple weeks. And yeah, you can reach out to me if you have any questions, or I can relay them to Thomas and Charlie about that series. But again, thank you. I really also want to thank our team here at CSG, all our facilitators, especially our team on the East Coast who've done this so late in the day, but it's really been a team effort. So thank you all. But I'll turn it over to Ashley and Sean for the final words.
Thank you so much. I too just want to thank all of the different participants, all of our different experts and presenters from CSG, and Dr. Sarah Desmarais, Dr. Deb Peinels, and our amazing, really an awesome conversation. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of that. So thank you, Teresa and Dr. Rodriguez. And I also just want to give a huge shout out to my colleague, Ashley, for all of the work that you put into all this. I think, there was so much behind the scenes, and I just really appreciate all the work you put into this. I think, just a wealth of information was shared in these 5 days. So, Ashley, thank you so much for everything. You did an amazing, outstanding job with all of this. And WebEx has certainly been a challenge that's, that no one anticipated or really wanted to deal with. So anyways, thank you so much for being behind the scenes and managing all those things. And thank you for all of the participants with all the questions as well. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I will just echo everybody else's appreciation. I think, this was a team effort, and I don't think this could have happened without one of the legs of the stool, so to speak. If we were missing any piece of this team, it wouldn't have been as successful. And we really hope that you, our counties, got some value out of this. I know you invested a lot of time with us and put a lot of faith into what we were doing here to help you. So thank you so much for going on this journey with us. And we really look forward to continuing to work with you and help you develop those programs and hopefully move into the next stage of contracting and implementing and getting more people into the community where they really should be. So I think with that, unless, maybe, is there anything that anybody else would like to say before we say our final goodbyes? Okay.
I just want to say, I thought I mentioned, but again, thank you, Katie and CSG, for all of your technical support and everything. Especially just all the different pieces with the housing and everything. That was amazing. So thank you again.
All right. So I think with that, we are finished with our first Diversion Academy. Thank you all so much. And please reach out at any time. You have my email, you have Sean's email, and we will answer any questions that we can, and we will be in touch soon with next steps. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.